She was the woman Prince Charles once called the only person who ever really understood him, an Australian, bright and loud and full of life, who walked into the most closed circle in Britain and made herself, for the better part of 20 years, one of the people standing closest to the heir to the throne. He gave her a nickname, Kanga, and it stuck so hard that the world eventually forgot she had ever been called anything else. She died at 49, paraplegic, divorced, sectioned under the Mental Health Act, her business gone, her body broken by a fall that no one has ever been able to explain with certainty, frozen out of the royal world that had once been the whole centre of her life. She died of blood poisoning in a London hospital in November 1997, 2.5 months after Princess Diana was killed in Paris, and a country that had spent that autumn mourning one woman in Charles's life, barely, registered the quiet death of another. The official story of Dale Tryon, where there is one at all, is a footnote, a colourful socialite, a friend of the royals, undone by illness and bad luck. It is the kind of summary that closes a file and turns out the light. It leaves almost everything out. Kanga Tryon did not simply fade. She was a vivid, gifted, difficult woman who got closer to Prince Charles than almost anyone alive, and who then committed the one sin the royal world has never learned to forgive. She talked. She told favoured journalists about the prince's telephone calls and his visits to her home. She let his letters lie around so that guests could admire his handwriting. In a world built on silence, on the iron discretion that protects the people at the very top, she could not keep quiet about how special she was, and the world she had charmed her way into shut its doors on her with a coldness that helped to break her. There is a second woman in this story, and the contrast between the two of them is the entire point. Camilla Parker Bowles was Kanga's rival for Charles in the 1970s, the other woman the prince could not do without. Camilla understood the rule. She never talked, and Camilla is queen today. Kanga, who talked, died forgotten in a hospital bed, her royal love letters mysteriously vanished, her name written out of the story that Camilla now sits at the centre of. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. This is the story of how that came to pass. Of a fearless Australian girl who survived a crippling childhood to become the life of every room she's ever entered, who got too close to the crown, and who paid for that closeness with her marriage, her health, her place in the world, and at the last with her life. And of a royal machine that protects its own without fail and quietly discards everyone else. There was a small girl in a Melbourne hospital who could not move, strapped from her feet to her chest in metal and leather, and the woman she grew into spent the rest of her life making up for those years of stillness. Dale Elizabeth Harper was born on the 3rd of January, 1948, in Melbourne, into the kind of comfortable, prosperous Australian household that money and ambition build. Her father, Barry Harper, was a printing magnate, a wealthy and successful businessman, and the family wanted for nothing in the material sense of things. Dale was the eldest of 3 children, the firstborn, and by every account she came into the world carrying an outsized share of energy and will, the sort of child who is the centre of a room before she can properly walk across it. She had a brightness about her from the very start, a vividness that people remembered, and in an ordinary life that brightness would simply have been a happy gift. In the life she actually lived, it became the thing that lifted her into the most rarefied circle in the world, and in the end, the thing that helped to destroy her. Before any of that, though, came the suffering, and it is worth dwelling on because it made her who she was. In early childhood, Dale was diagnosed with Perthes disease, a condition that attacks the hip joint, in which the blood supply to the head of the thigh bone fails, and the bone begins to die and crumble. In a young child, the treatment in those years was brutal in its simplicity. The affected leg had to be kept still, held rigid for long stretches so that the bone could slowly rebuild itself, and for Dale that meant being immobilized, encased in irons that ran from her feet all the way up to her chest, confined for long periods to a children's hospital. She had this condition and lived under its constraints until she was around 9 years old. A good part of her early childhood, the years when other children run and climb and learn the world through their bodies, she spent held motionless, her legs locked in metal, watching the world move around a body that could not join it. As if that were not enough for one small body to carry, she had also received, in childhood, a diagnosis of spina bifida, a condition of the spine present from birth. The details of how severely it affected her in those early years are not fully clear from the public record, but its presence in her medical history matters, because it meant that her body had been marked from the beginning by problems of the spine and the bones, the very systems that would, decades later, fail her so catastrophically. The girl who would one day be paralyzed by a fall had begun her life already fighting her own skeleton. You learn things, as a child immobilized for years, that stay with you. Some children broken in that way turn inward, grow cautious and quiet and small, and spend the rest of their lives flinching from a world that hurt them early. Dale Harper went the other way entirely. The years of stillness seemed to have lit in her a ferocious appetite for motion, for noise, for life lived as loudly and as fully as her body would allow. By the time she was free of the irons, free of the hospital, free to run, she ran at the world with an energy that those who knew her would describe, for the rest of her life, in superlatives. Family and friends spoke of her tremendous joie de vivre, her sheer delight in being alive, and there is every reason to think that delight was forged precisely in the years when being alive had meant lying still and watching everyone else. She had been denied movement, and she answered that denial with a lifelong refusal to sit quietly anywhere. This is the first thing to understand about Camilla Tryon. The qualities that later made her irresistible, the energy, the laughter, the way she filled a space and pulled every eye toward her, were not simply the gifts of a privileged girl with nothing to do. They were the hard-won spoils of a child who had fought her way out of confinement and was determined never to be still again. And the cruelest symmetry of her whole story is that it ended the way it began, with her body locked and motionless, the irons of childhood replaced by a wheelchair she could not rise from. The fearless woman who had spent her life in furious movement brought back, at the close, to the stillness she had spent everything fleeing. But that was decades away, and the young woman who emerged from that difficult childhood was, by all accounts, a force. She grew into a striking figure, blonde and vivacious, with the kind of presence that does not so much enter a room as take it over. She was funny, quick, warm, and utterly unafraid, possessed of a confidence that drew people to her, and an instinct for occupying the center of attention that never left her. In the Australia of the 1960s, a confident, ambitious young woman with that kind of personality had more room to move than her mother's generation had been allowed, and Dale moved into it without hesitation. She wanted a bigger life than the one laid out for a wealthy Melbourne girl, a life with more glamour and more noise and more of the world in it, and she set about getting it. Her first path toward that bigger life ran through journalism, and the choice would prove revealing in ways she could not have foreseen. She began her working life in the world of magazines and newspapers, starting out in the late 1960s as a reporter for the Australian Women's Weekly, one of the country's most widely read publications. It was a good fit for her gifts. Journalism rewarded exactly the qualities she had in abundance: the boldness to approach anyone, the charm to draw people out, the instinct for a story and for the people at the center of it. She was good with people, good at getting them to talk, good at the social machinery of the press, and she thrived in it. There is an irony here that the rest of her story will sharpen to a fine point. Dale Harper began her adult life inside the press, learning from the inside how newspapers worked, how stories were found and made and sold, how the relationship between a journalist and a source actually functioned. She understood that world. She knew its appetites and its currencies, and yet the very fluency with the press that served her so well as a young woman would become, when she was on the other side of it as the confidante of a prince, the instrument of her ruin. The woman who had been a reporter, who knew exactly what journalists wanted and how they used what they were given, could not, when it mattered most, stop herself from feeding them. She had spent her youth learning the language of the press, and she would spend her later life unable to stop speaking it, even when every rule of the world she had entered demanded her silence. Her ambition did not let her stay long on one continent. Australia, for all its space and sunshine, was a long way from the center of things, and Dale Harper wanted the center. At the end of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, she made her way to London, the heart of the old empire. the city where the kind of life she dreamed of was actually lived. She arrived as so many ambitious young people from the far edges of the Commonwealth arrived, carrying energy and charm, and not much else of the established kind. No title, no family standing in British society, no automatic place in the closed world she meant to conquer. What she had was herself, and in her case that turned out to be a great deal. In London she worked in and around the media and public relations, including a period handling public relations for the airline Qantas, the kind of role that suited her perfectly. Public relations was journalism's mirror image, the art of getting attention rather than reporting it, of shaping how people and companies were seen, of working the same machinery of press and publicity from the other side. She was good at it, for the same reasons she had been good at reporting. She knew people, she knew the press, she knew how attention was won and held, and she had the personality to make it all work. She was building, in those early London years, a particular kind of expertise, a deep practical understanding of publicity and of the people who manufactured it, and that expertise was bound up with her very identity. She was a creature of attention, professionally and personally, someone for whom being noticed was not a vanity, but very nearly a way of life. This is the second thing to understand about her, and it sits in uneasy tension with the first. The same drive that had carried her out of a hospital bed and across the world, the refusal to be still or small or overlooked, was also a hunger to be seen, to be at the centre, to matter visibly to the people who mattered. In a journalist or a publicist, that hunger is an asset. In the intimate of a royal family, in a world whose entire foundation is discretion and invisibility and the keeping of secrets, that same hunger is a loaded weapon, and it was pointed, though no one yet knew it, directly at her own future. Picture her, then, as she was in the early 1970s, newly arrived in London and ready for whatever the city would give her. A young Australian woman in her early 20s, blonde and quick and brimming with that hard-won appetite for life, a former reporter turned publicist, who understood attention better than almost anyone, carrying no aristocratic credentials, but more than enough personality to make up the difference. She was charming, and she was fearless, and she was, in the way of people who have suffered young and refused to let it crush them, entirely unintimidated by the grandeur she was about to walk into. The closed world of the British upper class, with its titles and its codes and its centuries of accumulated certainty about who belonged and who did not, was exactly the kind of room she had spent her whole life learning to take over. And she would take it over with remarkable speed. Within a very short time of arriving in England, this Australian outsider with no standing in British society would meet and marry a peer of the realm, a baron whose family stood at the inner edge of the royal household, and through that marriage she would be carried straight into the orbit of the future king. The girl from Melbourne, who had spent her childhood in irons, was about to become Baroness Tryon, and within that new identity she would meet the man who would name her Kanga and change, and ultimately help to end the whole course of her life. How that happened, how a woman who had been in London barely any time at all, married into one of the great establishment families, and found herself, almost overnight, on intimate terms with the Prince of Wales, is where the story turns next. Because the speed of her ascent was itself a kind of warning. She rose into that world so fast, on the strength of personality alone, that she never quite absorbed the one lesson the people born into it learned in the cradle. The lesson that would have saved her. She learned how to dazzle the royal world. She never learned how to keep its secrets. And the distance between those two things is the distance between Camilla Parker Bowles, who became Queen, and Dale Tryon, who died forgotten at 49. The world she was about to enter, and the marriage that opened its doors to her, is where we go now. There was something almost innocent in it, and that innocence is part of what makes the ending so cruel. Dale Harper did not learn discretion as a girl, because nothing in her life had ever taught her to value it. She came from a world where being interesting was the currency, where a good story told well was a social triumph rather than a betrayal, where the worst sin was to be dull. The press had been her training ground and her trade, and in that trade information was not a secret to be guarded, but a thing to be shared, traded, enjoyed. She grew up understanding that the way you became somebody was by having something to say and saying it brightly, to the right people, at the right moment. It was a perfectly good philosophy for a journalist, or a publicist, or a Melbourne socialite. It was a fatal one for the confidant of a king in waiting. Nobody ever sat her down in those formative years and taught her that there are rooms in which the people who survive are the ones who say nothing at all. She would have to learn that lesson the hard way, far too late, and the cost of the tuition would be everything she had. The thing that strikes you about how Dale Harper conquered England is the sheer speed of it. She arrived an outsider with no foothold in British society, and almost at once she found her way to a man who stood at the inner edge of the royal household. By some accounts, she had been in the country only a matter of weeks when she met Anthony Tryon. The girl from Melbourne who had no title, no family standing, no automatic place in the closed world of the British upper class, walked into that world and within a breath attached herself to one of its more interesting families. It was the kind of social acceleration that personality alone makes possible, and Dale had personality to spare. The man she met was Anthony George Merrick Tryon, heir to a barony and a figure who carried, in his own quiet way, a great deal of significance. He was a merchant banker, a man of the city rather than the gossip columns, reserved where she was loud, English to his bones where she was brashly Australian. On the surface, they were an unlikely match, the steady banker and the dazzling foreigner, and perhaps the contrast was part of the attraction. What mattered most about Anthony Tryon, for the shape of the life Dale was about to lead, was not his own character at all. It was his family, and the place that family occupied at the very heart of the British monarchy. To understand what Dale was marrying into, you have to look at the Tryons, because they were not aristocrats at the ornamental fringe of royal life. They were embedded in its machinery at the most intimate level. Anthony's father was the second Baron Tryon, and his service to the crown placed him among the most trusted men in the Queen's private world. He held the office of Keeper of the Privy Purse, which is one of those titles that sounds quaint until you understand what it actually controls. The Keeper of the Privy Purse manages the sovereign's private money, the personal finances of the monarch, the household accounts, the whole intricate business of the royal family's wealth. It is a position of enormous trust, given only to men the sovereign relies on absolutely, because it means handling the most private and sensitive matters there are. Anthony's father held that office for the better part of 2 decades, treasurer to the Queen herself, one of the small circle of officials who ran the inner life of the monarchy. This was not a family that admired the royals from a respectful distance. This was a family whose head spent his working life inside the palace, trusted with the sovereign's purse. The royal connections ran further still, threaded through the generations and the friendships. Anthony Tryon had himself served as a page of honour at the Queen's coronation in 1953, one of the boys chosen to attend the new monarch at that great ceremony, a mark of his family's standing and his own place within it. He had been to school alongside Edward Adaine, who would go on to become Prince Charles's private secretary, and the two men remained friends through the years, when both were bound up in the service of the Crown, holidaying at Balmoral during the royal family's annual stays in Scotland. The Tryons moved in the intimate royal circles as a matter of course. They were at Balmoral, at the palaces, woven into the social and professional fabric of the monarchy across decades. When you married a Tryon, you did not merely marry into the aristocracy, you married into the household, into the inner ring of people who surrounded the royal family in their private hours. There was a family seat to match this standing, a world of country grandeur into which Dale now stepped. The Tryon home was the manor house at Great Durnford, a village in Wiltshire, the kind of English country estate that anchors an aristocratic family to the land and to a way of life centuries old. Anthony's mother, Dreda, ran a boarding preparatory school at Great Durnford for 50 years, a fixture of the local establishment, and the whole setting spoke of the deep, rooted, unhurried confidence of the English upper class at home in its own country. For a vivacious young Australian raised in the bright newness of Melbourne, this was another planet, a world of damp green fields and ancient houses, and the quiet assurance of people who had never once in their lives doubted that they belonged. And Dale, with her usual fearlessness, walked into it as though she had been born to it. They married in the spring of 1973, on the 13th of April, and with that marriage Dale Elizabeth Harper of Melbourne became Baroness Tryon, a peeress of the realm, take the full measure of what she had accomplished. In a handful of years, an Australian woman with no aristocratic credentials, no inherited place in British society, nothing but her own energy and charm and her instinct for people, had married into one of the families closest to the throne and acquired a title and a seat at the very centre of the establishment. It was a triumph of personality over birth, exactly the kind of ascent that the rigid old world of the British upper class was supposed to make impossible, and she had managed it almost effortlessly. The doors that were meant to stay shut against outsiders had opened for her because she was simply too vivid and too charming to be kept out. But there was a shadow over the marriage from the very beginning, and it reached back to a man Dale had already met, a man she would never quite be free of, and it is here that the central tension of her whole life first shows itself. Dale had not come to Anthony Tryon as a stranger to his world. She had already crossed paths with the Prince of Wales. The full story of that earlier connection belongs to the next part of this account, but its presence hangs over the marriage from the start, because the man she was marrying was a close friend of Prince Charles, and the prince was the figure who would matter most in Dale's life, more than her husband, more than almost anyone. There is a version of events, reported and widely believed, in which Dale and Charles had been more than acquaintances in her early London years, before either of them married, and in which the vivacious blonde Australian was simply not considered the right sort of woman to become the wife of a future king. Whatever the precise nature of that early connection, the fact remains that Dale married a friend of Charles rather than Charles himself, and the prince stayed close, woven into the marriage through his friendship with her husband, present at its edges from the beginning. This is the strange and painful architecture of the life Dale built. The marriage that carried her into the royal world also carried her permanently into the orbit of the man she could not have, kept him forever within reach and forever out of reach at the same time. She had married into Charles's circle, which meant she would see him, know him, holiday alongside him, remain close to him for years. And she had married his friend rather than the prince, which meant that closeness would always be the closeness of the confidant, and never of the wife. She had been placed by her own marriage in exactly the position that would define and torment her, near to Charles always, his always in some sense, and yet belonging by law and by name to another man entirely. The strains in the marriage itself appeared with startling speed by Dale's own later account. Years afterward, looking back on her union with Anthony, she would say that she had realized it was doomed within 4 months of the wedding. 4 months. Whatever drew the banker and the Australian together had begun to come apart almost before the wedding flowers had wilted, and the marriage settled, over the years, into the kind of arrangement that holds together on paper, while the two people inside it live increasingly separate lives. Dale herself pointed, in part, to her husband's close friendships in the royal world as a source of the trouble, the bonds with men like Edward Adaine that drew Anthony into a circle and a set of loyalties that did not centre on his wife. The couple took separate holidays for years, going their own ways while keeping up the appearance of a marriage. Dale cruised the Mediterranean on the vast yacht of the shipping tycoon John Latsis, a vessel regularly used by Prince Charles and his friends in the summer, while her husband stayed at home. The marriage had become, fairly early on, a framework within which two people led lives that barely touched, and yet it endured, in form for nearly a quarter of a century, because in that world marriages often did. The aristocratic establishment had a long tolerance for unions that survived as social and practical arrangements while the affection inside them faded or strayed. Appearances were kept up. The marriage held its shape. Dale and Anthony had 4 children together, a daughter named Zoe, named Charles, and twins Edward and Victoria, and the family went on through the years with the outward solidity that such families maintained. The children gave the marriage a substance beyond the failing relationship of the 2 adults at its head, and the whole edifice of the Tryon household, the title, the country seat, the royal connections, the children, stood for decades even as the marriage at its core grew hollow. It is worth pausing on the son named Charles, because the detail tells you something about how close Dale stood to the prince, even at the start of her married life. When her son was born in 1976, the boy was christened Charles, and Prince Charles himself stood as his godfather. This was no distant social courtesy. To make the heir to the throne the godfather of your child is a mark of real intimacy, of a genuine and trusted closeness between the families. The prince was not a remote acquaintance of the Tryons. He was woven into their family life at the most personal level, godfather to their son, friend to the husband, and something more complicated and more charged to the wife. The Tryon marriage, troubled almost from the start, was conducted from the beginning in the immediate presence of Prince Charles, and his presence was part of its very fabric. So by the middle of the 1970s the structure of Dale's adult life was set. She had her title, her place in the establishment, her country house and her London life, her children, her failing marriage, and above all her closeness to the Prince of Wales. She had ascended into the royal world with a speed that few outsiders ever matched, and she had done it on the strength of the personality that had carried her out of a hospital bed and across the world. The energy, the charm, the fearlessness, the refusal to be overlooked, all of it had worked exactly as it always worked, and it had delivered her into the most exclusive circle in Britain. What she had not acquired in all that swift ascent was the one thing that circle ran on. She had married into a family that had served the crown for generations, that understood discretion in its bones, that knew without ever needing to be told that the first duty of anyone close to the royals is silence. The Tryons knew how to keep secrets. Anthony's father had spent his career keeping the most sensitive secrets there were, the private finances of the sovereign. The whole world Dale had married into was built on the keeping of confidences, on the understanding that what you saw and heard in the company of the royal family stayed locked behind your teeth forever. Dale had entered that world, but she had not absorbed its first law, because nothing in her bright, loud, attention-loving life had ever taught her to. She had the access. She did not have the instinct for silence that was supposed to come with it. The gap between those two things would take years to do its damage. For now, in the prime of her life, the failure to learn discretion looked like nothing at all, just the harmless exuberance of a charming woman who liked to talk. She was inside the circle, intimate with the prince, dazzling everyone she met, and the cost of her openness lay far in the future. The years immediately ahead would be the best of her life, the period of her deepest closeness to Charles, her greatest social triumph, her business success, her place at the very heart of the royal world. She was about to live the part of her story that justified everything, the years when being Kanga Tryon meant being one of the most enviable women in Britain, and at the centre of those years stood Prince Charles, and the relationship between them that was the engine of her whole life. How that relationship began, what it became, and why a vivacious married Australian came to occupy a place in the prince's heart that rivaled even Camilla Parker Bowles, is where the story turns next. Because to understand how far Dale Tryon eventually fell, you have to first understand how high the prince had once lifted her, and how real, by every account, the bond between them was. That bond, and the rivalry it set in motion, is where we go now. The boy who would one day be king first met the girl who would one day be Kanga on the far side of the world, in the Australian bush, when both of them were teenagers and neither had any idea what the other would come to mean. In 1966, Prince Charles, then 17 years old and heir to the British throne, was sent to Australia. The destination was Timbertop, a remote outpost of Geelong Grammar School set in the mountains of Victoria, a place designed to toughen privileged boys through hard physical living, far from comfort and from home. For Charles the experience was, by his own later accounts, one of the happiest stretches of his young life, a release from the cold formality of his English schooling and from the suffocating weight of being who he was. Australia treated him with a directness and a warmth that the buttoned-up world of his English upbringing never had. The people were less impressed by his rank, more inclined to take him as they found him, and the young prince, starved of exactly that kind of ease, responded to it with real gratitude. He spent 2 terms in the country, and he came to love it. It was during this Australian sojourn at a dance that he first encountered Dale Harper. She was 18, the vivid daughter of a Melbourne printing magnate, already in possession of the energy and charm that turned heads wherever she went. He was a shy and sensitive 17-year-old prince a very long way from home. We do not know the details of that first meeting, what passed between them, whether it amounted to anything more than a young man noticing a striking young woman across a crowded room. What we do know is that it happened, that the future king and the future Lady Tryon first crossed paths in the open warmth of Australia when both were barely more than children, and that the seed of a connection that would last the rest of their lives was planted there, in the country Charles loved, far from the watchful eyes of the British court. To understand why Dale would come to matter so much to Charles, you have to understand the kind of young man he was, and the kind of emotional world he had been raised in. Charles was a sensitive, thoughtful, somewhat lonely boy, and the upbringing he had been given did little to nourish those qualities and much to wound them. He had been raised in the formal, undemonstrative atmosphere of the royal family, by parents who loved him in their way, but who belonged to a world and a generation that did not deal easily in open affection. His mother was the Queen, bound up from his early childhood in the relentless duties of the crown, often absent on the long official tours that the role demanded. His father, Prince Philip, was a man of brisk, masculine, occasionally harsh temperament, who seems to have found his elder son's gentleness puzzling and worth toughening out of him. Charles had been sent to Gordonstown, the austere Scottish boarding school his father had chosen precisely for its hardness, and he had been miserable there, a soft and bookish boy thrown into a culture of cold showers and rough games that bullied and isolated him. He emerged from all of it a man who carried, beneath the polish of his position, a deep hunger for warmth, for understanding, for someone who would simply take him as he was, and make him feel cared for rather than measured. This is the man Dale Harper kept meeting, and it is why she had such an effect on him. She offered by her very nature exactly what he had been starved of. She was warm where his world was cold, open where it was guarded, full of laughter and life where it was heavy with duty and restraint. She made him feel, by all accounts, easy and understood and delighted in, and for a man raised in emotional austerity, that was very nearly intoxicating. The qualities that had carried Dale out of her hospital bed and across the world, the fearless appetite for life, the gift for making people feel the warmth of her attention, met in Charles a man who needed precisely those things more than he needed almost anything, and the meeting of his hunger and her warmth was the foundation of everything that followed between them. Their paths crossed again in earnest when Dale moved to London at the turn of the decade, and this time the connection deepened to something that went well beyond a teenage memory. By the early 1970s, Charles was a young man in his early 20s, out of university, embarking on a naval career, and beginning the part of his life in which the question of women and marriage loomed ever larger over him and over the institution he would one day head. Dale was in London working in public relations, in her early 20s herself, as vivid and charming as ever. They reconnected, and according to widely reported and broadly accepted accounts, the reconnection became a romance. In this period, before either of them was married, the Prince and the Australian became, by many accounts, lovers. This was the time when Charles was single, before the pressures of marriage and succession had closed around him, and the relationship between him and Dale in those early London years has been reported by numerous biographers and journalists, and is generally accepted even by those who are sceptical of later claims. The vivacious blonde who had caught his eye in Australia became, for a time, one of the women in the young prince's life. It was in these years that the elements of their bond took the form they would keep for the rest of their lives. There were shared pursuits that gave the relationship a real and ordinary substance beyond romance. Both Charles and Dale loved fly fishing, the patient, absorbing country sport, and they fished together regularly over the years, standing in rivers in the quiet companionship that such activity creates. It was the kind of shared interest that bound them in a way that went deeper than glamour, a genuine common ground, an ease in each other's company doing something they both loved. And it was in these years that Charles gave her the name that would define her. He called her Kanga, short for kangaroo, a nickname born of her Australian origins and her bouncy, irrepressible personality, the energy that bounded through every room she entered. The name was affectionate, intimate, the kind of pet name that signals real closeness, and it stuck so completely that it eventually displaced her own. To the prince, and in time to the whole world, Dale Tryon became simply Kanga. The depth of what Charles felt for her is captured in the words he is reported to have used about her, words that have followed her memory ever since. He described Kanga, in a phrase that has been quoted again and again, as the only woman who ever really understood him. Set that phrase against everything we know about the man, the lonely boy, the emotional starvation of his upbringing, the lifelong hunger for someone who would simply see him and accept him, and you grasp what Dale meant to him. To be called the only woman who understood him by a man so desperate to be understood is to be placed at the very center of his emotional life. It was an extraordinary thing for the heir to the throne to say about a woman, and it tells you that the bond between them was not a passing fancy but something Charles felt at the deepest level, a connection he valued above almost any other. And yet for all of that, Dale Harper was never going to become the Princess of Wales. And the reasons cut to the cold heart of how the monarchy chose its brides. The woman who married a future king had to meet a set of requirements that had nothing to do with whether the prince loved her or whether she understood him. She had to be, in the eyes of the establishment and the court, suitable, and suitability was a narrow and unforgiving category. The ideal royal bride of that era was aristocratic, or at least of impeccable English breeding, with a background that could withstand any scrutiny. She was expected to be young, untouched by scandal, free of any past that the press could seize upon, the kind of woman who could be presented to the nation as a spotless future queen. Dale Harper failed these tests on nearly every count. She was Australian, a commoner from a family that had made its money in trade, the daughter of a printing magnate rather than a landed lord. She was vivacious, sexually confident, a striking blonde with a personality that drew attention rather than deflecting it, the very opposite of the demure, malleable, background figure that the role was thought to require. She was, in the brutal shorthand of the court, not suitable marriage material for the heir to the throne, and that judgment had nothing to do with her worth as a person and everything to do with a set of requirements designed to produce a particular kind of consort. There is a cruelty in this that the whole story turns on. The woman Charles is said to have called the only one who ever understood him was deemed unfit to marry him, precisely because the qualities that made her understand him, the warmth, the boldness, the vivid unguarded personality, were the qualities the establishment could not accept in a queen. The very things that made her right for him as a person made her wrong for him as a match, and the institution that would one day choose his wife had no interest in whether he was understood or loved. It wanted a suitable consort, and Dale was not it. So the prince who valued her above almost anyone was steered away from her by the same machinery that would, throughout his life, subordinate his happiness to the requirements of the crown. He could love her, he could not marry her. The institution had spoken, and what it said was that warmth and understanding counted for nothing against the cold checklist of suitability. And so, in 1973, the two of them did what the situation demanded. Dale married Anthony Tryon, the prince's friend, the reserved banker from the family, at the heart of the royal household, taking the title and the place in the establishment that her connection to that world afforded her. She did not marry the man she had been close to. She married into his circle instead, accepting the role of the intimate rather than the wife, placed forever near to Charles and forever barred from being more to him in the eyes of the world. It was a settlement of sorts, the kind that the upper class made all the time, a marriage of position and convenience that left the heart's true attachment unresolved and unspoken, lingering beneath the surface of a respectable union. The symmetry of that year deepens the whole picture, because Dale was not the only woman who understood Charles and married someone else in 1973. In the same period, Camilla Shand married Andrew Parker Bowles, becoming Camilla Parker Bowles, taking herself off the market as a potential royal bride, just as Dale did. The two women who would spend the coming years as rivals for Charles's heart both married other men within the same span of time, both of them deemed unsuitable to marry the prince himself, both of them settling into marriages with other men while their real connection to Charles remained. It is one of the strange facts of his life that the two women he was closest to in his youth, Camilla and Kanga, both married elsewhere in 1973, and both remained bound to him afterward, the unsuitable women he could not marry, but could not let go of either. This is the position from which the rest of Dale's life unfolded, and it was an impossible one from the start. She was married to a man she had realized within months she should not have married. She was tied for life to the establishment through that marriage and through her husband's deep royal connections, and she remained close, intimately and emotionally close, to the Prince of Wales, the man the institution had decreed she could not have, who had nonetheless named her, valued her, and called her the only woman who understood him. She would spend the coming years living inside that contradiction, the confidante who was something more, the wife of one man whose heart and whose history belonged in part to another, the Australian outsider lodged permanently near the centre of a royal world that had let her in but would never fully let her belong. For a time, the contradiction was bearable, even glorious. The years immediately ahead would see Dale at the height of everything, deep inside the prince's inner circle, close to him as few people were, living a life of glamour and access and intimacy that most people could only imagine. She had not become the Princess of Wales, but she had become something that in its own way was nearly as remarkable, one of the small handful of people closest to the future king, trusted, beloved, woven into his private life. And in that inner circle, she would find herself in direct competition for his affection with the other unsuitable woman of 1973, Camilla Parker Bowles, in a rivalry that would run for years and that would, in the end, separate the two women's fates more completely than anyone could have foreseen. The two of them, Kanga and Camilla, the prince's two great attachments, both married, both close to him, both vying in their different ways for the central place in his heart, would spend the 1970s in a quiet contest whose outcome shaped both their lives. One of them played the game with a discipline the other never learned. One of them kept every secret while the other could not, and the difference between them, invisible at the time, would in the end be the difference between the woman who became queen and the woman who died, forgotten at 49. How that rivalry played out, how deep inside the royal world Kanga actually got, and how the contest between the two women began to reveal the fatal difference in their natures, is where the story turns next. For a stretch of the 1970s, Prince Charles was a single young man with two married women at the center of his emotional life, and the quiet contest between them is one of the strangest and most revealing episodes in his entire history. The two women were Camilla Parker Bowles and Camilla Tryon, and to the small circle who knew what was happening, the prince's heart seemed to swing between them, each of them holding a claim on him, each of them closer to him than almost anyone, neither of them able to make him fully and finally her own. The Channel 4 documentary that later examined this period, made in 2008 and titled with deliberate provocation Prince Charles's Other Mistress, laid out the dynamic in stark terms. According to that account, when Kanga first entered the prince's inner circle, it marked the first time Camilla had a serious rival for his affections. This is worth pausing on, because the popular history of Charles's love life has been so thoroughly dominated by Camilla, presented for decades as the one great constant love of his life, that the existence of a genuine rival has been almost entirely written out of the story. Yet in the 1970s, by these accounts, Camilla was not the unchallenged occupant of the prince's heart. She had competition, and the competition was the vivacious Australian, Kanga, who had walked into Charles's circle and captivated him so thoroughly that the woman who would one day be queen found herself, for the first time, with a rival she had to reckon with. The documentary described the contest between the two women in language that captures how intertwined their lives with Charles had become. Throughout the 1970s, it suggested there was a kind of tug-of-war for the prince's heart between Camilla and Kanga, and the rhythm of that contest was shaped by the women's own lives, by the fact that both of them were married and both of them were bearing children during these years. When one of them was pregnant, the account went, the other would be the keeper of Charles's heart, the two of them passing the role between them as the circumstances of their lives allowed. It is an extraordinary picture. Two married women taking turns as the prince's closest companion, their availability to him rising and falling with their pregnancies and their domestic situations, Charles moving between them as each became more or less able to give him what he wanted. Whatever the precise truth of the arrangement, the picture it paints is of a prince deeply entangled with both women at once, and of two women who were rivals, and yet somehow accommodated each other within the strange shared orbit of his affection. The mark of how real Kanga's place in this world was can be measured by the milestones of intimacy that punctuated it. When her son Charles was born in 1976, the prince attended the christening and stood as the boy's godfather, a sign of closeness that no one bestows lightly. This was during the very years of the supposed rivalry, and it shows how thoroughly woven into Kanga's life Charles had become. He was not a distant figure she occasionally saw. He was godfather to her child, present at the most personal family occasions, bound to her household by ties of genuine intimacy. Kanga had achieved something remarkable for a woman the establishment had deemed unsuitable. She had made herself, despite everything, a fixture in the prince's private world, close enough that he stood as godfather to her son and called her the only woman who understood him, a rival to Camilla herself for the central place in his heart. To grasp just how deep inside the royal world Kanga had got, you have to look at where she spent her time and who she spent it among. Because her access went far beyond the prince alone. By the height of her years in the circle, Kanga was on intimate terms with virtually the entire royal family, and she moved through their most private spaces as a regular and welcome guest. She stayed with the royals at Balmoral, the family's beloved Scottish estate, where they retreated each summer to be themselves, far from public view, in the one place where the formality of their public lives gave way to something like ordinary family holiday. She stayed at Windsor Castle and at Sandringham, the other great private residences where the royal family lived their off-duty lives. These were not places that admitted outsiders. To be a guest at Balmoral, to stay with the family at Sandringham, was to be admitted to the inner sanctum, to be counted among the small number of people the royals trusted enough to have around them when they were not performing for the world. Kanga was one of those people. The Australian commoner who had arrived in England with no standing at all had made herself a regular guest in the most private homes of the British monarchy, intimate with the Queen, with Princess Margaret, with the whole family. The glamour of this life ran beyond the royal residences and out across the wider world of wealth and privilege in which the prince and his friends moved. Kanga cruised the Mediterranean aboard the Alexander, the vast yacht belonging to the Greek shipping tycoon John Latsis, a vessel the size of a small liner that was regularly placed at the disposal of Prince Charles and his circle for their summer pleasures. This was the world at its most rarefied, the floating palaces of billionaires lent to royalty, the sun-drenched luxury of the very richest people on earth, and Kanga moved through it as one of the prince's intimates, sailing the Mediterranean in a style few human beings ever experience. She knew the artist David Hockney, who would come to her table to pay his respects. She was, in these years, a woman at the absolute centre of a charmed and glittering world, the world of royalty and old money and famous names, admitted to all of it on the strength of her closeness to the future king and her own irrepressible personality. This was the summit of Kanga's life, the height from which everything would later fall, and it is important to see it clearly, because the depth of the eventual tragedy can only be measured against the dazzle of these years. She had everything: title, access, glamour, intimacy with the royal family, the love and trust of the prince, a successful place in the most exclusive society on earth. The girl from Melbourne, who had spent her childhood in irons, had climbed, on the strength of her own vivid nature, to a position that the highest-born women in Britain might have envied. She stood inside the inner circle of the monarchy, beloved of its heir, a regular guest in its private homes, sailing the Mediterranean on billionaires' yachts. It was a life of almost unimaginable privilege and access, and Kanga lived it to the full, with all the appetite for life that had always defined her. And running beneath all of it, invisible at the height of her glory, was the fault line that would eventually swallow her, and it showed itself most clearly in the contrast between Kanga and her rival. Camilla Parker Bowles and Camilla Tryon were rivals for the same man, but they were profoundly different women, and the difference between them was not one of beauty or charm, or even of the prince's affection. It was a difference of understanding, of instinct, of the deep grasp of how the royal world actually worked and what it demanded of those it admitted. The documentary that examined their rivalry put the contrast with painful precision. Camilla, it observed, was the consummate insider who knew how to play the royal game. Kanga, by contrast, was a talented amateur, and in that distinction lay the seeds of everything that would later separate their fates so utterly. Consider what it meant to be the consummate insider that Camilla was. Camilla came from the English aristocracy, born into the world Kanga had merely married into, raised from birth among the people and the codes of the upper class. She understood, in her bones, the rules that governed life near the royal family, and the first and most absolute of those rules was discretion. Camilla knew that the way you survived in the prince's orbit, the way you kept his trust and your place, was by saying nothing, ever, to anyone about what passed between you. She never spoke to the press about Charles. She kept every secret, maintained every silence, played the long, patient game of the insider, who understands that invisibility is the price of permanence. Whatever passed between her and the prince stayed entirely private, locked away from the world, and that discretion was the foundation on which her decades-long relationship with Charles was built. Camilla played the game perfectly, and the game rewarded her, in the end, beyond anything she could have imagined, as a young woman married to Andrew Parker Bowles. Kanga was the opposite, and her nature made her so. She was a talented amateur, brilliant and charming and vivid, but lacking the bred-in-the-bone understanding of the rules that Camilla possessed as a birthright. Kanga had come from a world of journalism and publicity and Australian openness, a world where the currency was being interesting and the sin was being dull, where a good story told to the right people was a triumph. She did not have the instinct for silence that the royal world required, because nothing in her life had ever taught it to her. She loved attention, loved to be seen as special, loved the validation of being known as the woman close to the prince, and that love would prove fatal in a world where the one unbreakable rule was to keep your closeness secret. Where Camilla guarded the relationship in absolute silence, Kanga could not resist letting the world know how special she was, and that difference, invisible and harmless in the glory years, was the difference that would eventually destroy her. This is the cruel mechanism at the heart of Kanga's whole story, and it was already in place at the height of her triumph. The very qualities that had lifted her into the royal world, the warmth, the openness, the vivid need to be seen and known, were the qualities that the royal world could not finally tolerate. She had charmed her way in on the strength of exactly the traits that the rules of that world forbade. The institution had let her in because she was irresistible, and it would cast her out because she was indiscreet, and both things flowed from the same source, the same bright, loud, attention-loving nature that had carried her out of a Melbourne hospital and across the world. She was let in for being Kanga, and she would be destroyed for being Kanga, and the tragedy was woven into her from the start. For now, though, at the summit of her life in the late 1970s, none of the damage had been done. She was inside the circle, close to the prince, glamorous and beloved, a rival to Camilla for the central place in his heart, a regular guest in the royal homes, sailing the Mediterranean on billionaires' yachts. The cost of her openness lay in the future, and the future had not yet arrived. She was living the best years of her life, and they were extraordinary years, the years that any account of her must hold up against the darkness that came after, so that the fall can be measured against the height. But the world she lived in was about to change in a way that would reshape everything, including her own place in the prince's life. At the end of the 1970s and the start of the 1980s, the great unresolved question of Charles's existence, the question of whom he would marry, was finally going to be answered, and the answer would transform the entire landscape of his relationships. The prince was going to take a wife at last, a suitable one this time, a young woman the establishment could accept, and the arrival of that woman would change the positions of everyone in his orbit, Camilla and Kanga alike. The cozy, intimate world of the prince and his two married confidante was about to be disrupted by the entrance of the most famous woman of the age. The coming of Diana and the way it scrambled the alliances and rivalries that had defined Charles's private world, and the strange and revealing role Kanga came to play as that new marriage began its long descent into misery, is where the story turns next. In 1983, at the height of her powers and her access, Camilla Tryon did something that set her apart from the other women in the prince's orbit. She built something of her own. She started a business, put her own name and energy behind it, and turned herself from a society wife and royal intimate into a successful entrepreneur in one of the most competitive industries in the world. The business was a fashion label, and she called it, with the bold self-assurance that defined her, Kanga, after the nickname the prince had given her, planting her own identity at the center of a commercial enterprise that would carry her name into shops and onto the backs of the most fashionable women in Britain. The shop sat on Beauchamp Place in Knightsbridge, one of the most exclusive shopping streets in London, in the heart of the wealthiest part of the city, surrounded by the boutiques and the money of the international rich. The location was no accident. Kanga was placing her business exactly where her clientele lived and shopped, in the small, expensive enclave of London, where the aristocracy and the wealthy and the fashionable converged. She designed bright, distinctive clothing, and she launched the venture with the same instinct for publicity that she had possessed all her life, the instinct of the former journalist and publicist who understood, better than almost anyone, how attention was won. She promoted the label through television appearances, and through the social connections she had spent years accumulating, using her place in the glittering world she inhabited to draw eyes to the clothes that bore her name. The business succeeded, and it succeeded in the way that mattered most, by capturing exactly the right clientele. The Kanga label became a favorite of the Sloane Ranger set, the term coined for the young, well-bred, well-off women of London's smartest districts, the daughters and wives of the upper middle class and the aristocracy who set the tone of fashionable life in the 1980s. These were Kanga's people, the world she moved in, and they took to her clothes with enthusiasm. The label grew into a successful international business, a genuine commercial achievement, and it gave Kanga something that none of her royal access could provide, a thing that was entirely her own, built by her own effort, bearing her own name, a source of identity and accomplishment independent of any man. She was not merely a society wife or a prince's confidante. She was a businesswoman who had built a real and thriving enterprise, the cutthroat world of fashion, and the achievement was hers alone. The crowning moment of the label's rise, and one of the most telling episodes in the whole tangled story of Kanga and the royals, came in 1985, and it involved the most famous and most photographed woman in the world. By the middle of the 1980s, Diana, Princess of Wales, was the global phenomenon that Charles's marriage had created. The young woman whose face sold every magazine she appeared on, whose clothes were studied and copied across the planet, whose every public choice was scrutinized for meaning. And in 1985, Kanga persuaded Diana to wear one of her dresses to Live Aid, the vast charity concert that was watched by an audience of unprecedented size around the world. To have Diana, the most influential fashion figure on earth, wear a Kanga dress at one of the most watched events of the decade was a publicity triumph beyond anything money could buy. It placed Kanga's clothing in front of an enormous global audience, on the body of the one woman whose endorsement carried more weight than any other, and it was a coup that any fashion designer in the world would have given anything to pull off. Kanga, with her gift for connection and her place in the royal world, had pulled it off, and the label rode the moment. But the choice of Diana wearing Kanga's dress carried a meaning far beyond commerce, and it points to the strange and shifting web of alliances that Charles's marriage had created among the women in his life. By 1985, the marriage between Charles and Diana was already in serious trouble, and the cause that lay at the heart of that trouble was Camilla Parker Bowles. Charles had married Diana, but his attachment to Camilla had not ended, and as the young princess came to understand that her husband's heart belonged to another woman, the marriage curdled into one of the most famously unhappy unions of the century. Diana, isolated and wounded, found herself in a kind of war with Camilla, the woman she came to see, with reason, as the true rival for her husband's love. And in that war, the alliances among Charles's women rearranged themselves in unexpected ways. Diana and Kanga, by these accounts, joined forces. The two women, the wife and the former rival, found themselves on the same side against the common adversary, Camilla, and Diana's decision to wear a Kanga dress was read at the time as a deliberate move in that conflict, a clear message aimed at Camilla, a public signal of where Diana's alliances lay. Consider the strangeness of this realignment. Kanga had been Camilla's rival for Charles in the 1970s, one of the two women who had vied for his heart before his marriage. Now in the 1980s, with Diana installed as the wife and Camilla as the enduring mistress, Kanga found herself allied with the wife against her old rival. The vivacious Australian who had once competed with Camilla for the prince now stood with Diana in the princess's struggle against that same Camilla. The web of these relationships had become so tangled that yesterday's rivals were today's allies, the position shifting as the central drama of Charles's loveless marriage reshaped everyone's place in it. Kanga, ever close to the action, ever woven into the prince's world, had found a new role in the new configuration, the friend and ally of the wronged princess, united with Diana against the woman they both, in their different ways, had cause to resent. This was the peak of Kanga's life, the early to middle 1980s, the years when everything she had built came together at its height. She had her title and her place in the establishment. She had her intimacy with the prince and her access to the royal homes. She had her glamorous life among the rich and the famous, the yachts and the parties and the famous friends. And now she had her own success, her thriving fashion business, her name on an international label, the triumph of Diana wearing her dress before the eyes of the world. She was a woman who had reached by the strength of her own vivid nature a summit of access and accomplishment and glamour that few people ever approach. The girl from the Melbourne hospital had become Camilla Tryon, businesswoman, baroness, intimate of royalty, friend to princesses, a fixture of the most exclusive world on earth, and yet, woven through the very triumph, was the flaw that would destroy her, and the fashion business itself shows it at work. Look again at what Kanga had done, and you can see her nature operating in a way that was brilliant in commerce and fatal in everything else. She had named her business after the prince's pet name for her, placing her royal connection at the very center of her commercial identity, advertising to the world the intimacy that the rules of the royal world demanded be kept hidden. She had built her success on her access, on her closeness to the royals, on her ability to deliver Diana in a Kanga dress, trading openly on connections that the discreet players of the royal game would never have dreamed of exploiting so visibly. The business was, in a sense, the monetization of her royal intimacy, the turning of her closeness to the prince and the princess into a commercial asset, and that was exactly the kind of thing the royal world could not finally tolerate. Camilla would never have done it. Camilla kept her connection invisible, guarded it in silence, never traded on it, never advertised it. Kanga built a company around hers and put it in the window of a shop on Beauchamp Place. The same trait ran through her social life, and it was beginning, in these years, to harden into the pattern that would ruin her. Kanga loved attention, loved being known as the woman close to the prince, loved the validation that came from her place in the royal world, and she was not built to keep that closeness to herself. She was a talker, a connector, a woman who lived for the warmth of being known and noticed, and as the years passed, she became less and less able to resist, letting the world see how special she was to Charles. The very success of her business depended on her visibility, on her willingness to put her royal connection on display, and that willingness was bleeding, more and more, into a broader indiscretion, a growing inability to keep the secrets that her place in the prince's life required. The businesswoman who advertised her royal nickname was the same woman who would soon be telling journalists about the prince's private calls, and the trait was one and the same, the constitutional incapacity for silence that defined her and doomed her. For the moment, at the height of her success, the indiscretion still looked like exuberance, the harmless openness of a charming woman who liked to be at the center of things. The cost had not yet come due. She was thriving, glamorous, successful, beloved, and the years of her triumph rolled on with no sign of the catastrophe ahead. But the pattern was set, and it was deepening. Each year that passed saw Kanga a little more visible, a little more willing to trade on her royal closeness, a little more incapable of the discretion that the world she lived in demanded above all else. The flaw was growing alongside the success, the two of them feeding on the same source, and the moment was approaching when the flaw would outgrow the success and bring the whole edifice down. That moment came at the end of the 1980s, when Kanga's indiscretion finally crossed the line from exuberance into betrayal, when she began to talk to the press about the prince in ways that could no longer be tolerated or ignored, and when the tabloids published the claims that would mark the beginning of her exclusion from the world she had spent her life conquering. The cardinal sin she was about to commit, the one unforgivable act in the royal world, was the act of talking, and she was about to commit it in the most public way imaginable. How Kanga broke the one rule that mattered, what exactly she said, and to whom, and how the publication of her indiscretions began the long, cold process of freezing her out of the royal world, is where the story turns next. Because everything that follows, the exclusion, the unraveling, the illness, the broken body, the lonely death, flowed from this single failure, the failure to keep quiet, the inability to do the one thing the world she had entered required of her above all others. The deepest root of the trouble lay in her relationship with journalists, and it is here that her own past came back to undo her. Kanga had begun her working life inside the press, a reporter who had learned the trade from within, and she never stopped thinking of journalists as her natural company. To her they were not adversaries to be managed and held at arm's length. They were colleagues, confidants, people she liked and trusted and enjoyed, the kind of company she had kept since her 20s. She cultivated favoured reporters, gave them her time, took them into her confidence, treated the relationship between a famous woman and the press as a friendship rather than a transaction conducted at a wary distance. For the business, this was an enormous asset. It got her label written about, kept her name in the columns, delivered the publicity that no advertising budget could buy. A woman who counted journalists as friends had a permanent line into the newspapers, and she used it brilliantly to build her commercial success. But the royal world ran on the exact opposite principle, and the gulf between the two could not have been wider. To the people around the monarchy, the press was the enemy, full stop, a predatory force to be fed nothing, told nothing, trusted with nothing ever. The first thing anyone close to the royals learned was that journalists were not friends but threats, that the warmth a reporter showed you was the warmth of a man with a notebook, that anything you said in their company would end up in print sooner or later and could never be taken back. Camilla understood this completely. She treated the press as a danger to be evaded, gave them nothing, maintained an absolute silence that protected her for decades. The whole apparatus of the royal household was built on keeping the newspapers starved and at bay, on the iron understanding that the press and the palace were on opposite sides of a permanent war. Kanga stood on the wrong side of that war by instinct and by history, and she could not change her nature. She liked journalists, she trusted them, she talked to them as friends, the way she always had, and she did it inside a world where talking to journalists at all was the gravest possible breach of the unwritten code. The very fluency with the press that had built her business, that had made her so good at publicity, that had carried Diana's dress onto the front pages, was the fluency that would feed her own destruction. Every friendly lunch with a reporter, every confidence shared with a journalist she liked and trusted, was a small loosening of the silence the royal world demanded, and the more comfortable she grew with the press, the closer she drifted toward the disclosures that would finish her. She had spent her youth on the other side of the notebook, and she never learned to fear the people who held it. On the 29th of July 1981, in front of a global television audience of hundreds of millions, Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer in St. Paul's Cathedral, and the world was told it was witnessing a fairy tale. It was nothing of the kind, and the gulf between the spectacle and the truth would shape the rest of Camilla Tryon's life. Because the marriage that the world celebrated as a romance was, for the people inside the prince's circle, the beginning of a long and poisonous unhappiness that would eventually consume them all. Understand first why Charles married Diana at all, because the reasons explain so much about the cruelty of his whole emotional life and about the position of the women in it. By 1981, the pressure on the heir to the throne to marry and produce an heir had become irresistible. He was in his early 30s, long past the age at which a prince was expected to take a wife, and the institution he would one day head needed him settled and provided with a successor. The bride had to be suitable, and suitability meant exactly what it had always meant, the narrow, unforgiving category that had ruled Charles out of marrying the women he was actually close to. Diana Spencer met the requirements that Kanga and Camilla had failed. She was young, aristocratic, the daughter of an earl, with a spotless background and an unblemished reputation. The kind of woman the establishment could present to the nation as a future queen without a flicker of anxiety. She was, in the brutal calculus of the court, suitable, and that suitability, far more than love, was why Charles married her. The problem, the thing that doomed the marriage from its first day, was that suitability and love had nothing to do with each other, and Charles's heart had never belonged to the suitable bride. It belonged, as it had for years, to Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman the establishment had deemed unfit, just as it had deemed Kanga unfit. And Charles's attachment to Camilla did not end when he married Diana. He carried it into the marriage, kept Camilla in his life, maintained the bond that the wedding was supposed to have replaced. The young princess, who had entered the marriage, believing in the fairy tale she had been sold, came slowly and devastatingly to understand that her husband loved another woman, that the marriage was crowded from the start by a presence she could not dislodge. Diana would later describe the situation in a phrase that became famous around the world, observing that there had been 3 people in the marriage, which made it rather crowded. The third person was Camilla, and the knowledge of her destroyed Diana's happiness and turned the celebrated royal marriage into a private war. Where did all of this leave Kanga Tryon? In an impossible position, tangled into every side of a conflict that was tearing the royal world apart. Kanga was bound to Charles by years of intimacy, the woman he had called the only one who understood him, godmother close to his world, his confidant and former love. She was bound to Diana too, by the alliance the 2 women had formed against their common adversary, the friendship that had led Diana to wear a Kanga dress as a message to Camilla. And she had her own long history with Camilla, the rivalry of the 1970s that had since curdled into the strange enmity of women who had competed for the same man. Kanga stood, in other words, at the crossing point of all the major relationships in the prince's collapsing private life, connected to Charles, allied with Diana, opposed to Camilla, woven into a 4-cornered drama in which every position was charged and every loyalty was suspect. It was a precarious place to stand, and as the marriage descended into open misery through the 1980s, the precariousness grew. For a time, Kanga's tangled loyalties were survivable because the war was still private and the lines were not yet drawn with the brutal clarity they would later acquire. Through the early and middle 1980s, the unhappiness of the Charles and Diana marriage was kept behind the palace walls, hidden from a public that still believed in the fairy tale. And in that period of concealment, there was room for a woman like Kanga to remain close to multiple parties at once, friend to Diana and confidant to Charles, her divided loyalties not yet forced into a choice. She moved through the royal world as she always had, glamorous and connected, her business thriving, her place in the prince's orbit apparently secure, even as the marriage at the center of that world rotted from within. But the cracks were widening, and as the decade wore on, Kanga's own name began to surface in the rumors that swirled around the prince, and the surfacing marked the beginning of her trouble. In 1987, the British tabloids published claims that touched Kanga directly, claims that she and Charles had been conducting an affair. The marriage to Diana was visibly straining by then, the strain beginning to leak into the press, despite the palace's efforts at concealment, and into that atmosphere came the reports linking the prince to the vivacious Australian who had been close to him for so long. The biographer Giles Brandreth, in his well-regarded account of Charles and Camilla, described how the rumour took hold. A paparazzi photograph, he recounted, had captured something that the press misread, and from that misreading spread the story that an old flame of the prince's, Dale Tryon, had once again become part of his life. The tabloids ran with it, publishing the suggestion that Kanga and Charles had rekindled or were conducting a romance, putting her name into the swirling speculation about the prince's love for the very moment that speculation was becoming most dangerous. It must be said clearly, fairness to the truth and to the people involved, that the Tryon family consistently denied these claims of an affair. The 2008 documentary that examined Kanga's life noted that the family had continually denied the tabloid claims of a relationship between Kanga and Charles in this period. The nature of the bond between Kanga and the prince in the 1970s, when he was single, is broadly accepted by biographers, but the later claims of an affair during his marriage to Diana were rejected by her family, and they remain, in that sense, allegations rather than established fact. What is not in dispute is that the claims were made, that they were published, and that they placed Kanga's name in the middle of the most sensitive and explosive subject in the country, the question of whether the Prince of Wales was unfaithful to his wife. Whether or not there was an affair, the appearance of one, splashed across the tabloids, was itself a catastrophe for a woman whose place in the royal world depended on discretion. And here the deeper pattern of Kanga's vulnerability begins to show itself, because the affair claims did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged, at least in part, from Kanga's own habits, from the very indiscretion that was her defining flaw. The reason the rumours about Kanga had purchase, the reason journalists were willing to believe and publish them, was that Kanga herself had been talking. She had been telling favoured journalists about her relationship with the prince, sharing details that no discreet member of the royal circle would ever have shared, feeding the very press appetite that then turned the morsels into front-page claims. She told reporters, by various accounts, about how the prince would telephone her, how he would ask to come and visit her at her Wiltshire home, describing these visits in a coy euphemism, calling them comfort stops. She let it be known, to the people she trusted in the press, that Charles came to her for solace, that she was the woman he turned to, that their bond was alive and intimate. She was, in other words, advertising her closeness to the prince, to the very journalist who would use that advertising against her, and the affair claims of 1987 were the natural harvest of seeds she had planted herself. This was the cardinal sin taking shape, the fatal flaw moving from harmless exuberance toward genuine catastrophe, and the timing could not have been worse. The royal world in the late 1980s was becoming a place of paranoia and warfare, the marriage of Charles and Diana descending toward an open conflict that would soon explode into the public sphere with unprecedented violence. In such an atmosphere, with the press circling with both Charles and Diana increasingly desperate about what was being said and leaked, a woman like Kanga, who counted journalists as friends and could not stop talking about her royal connections, became a liability of the most dangerous kind. She was a leak waiting to happen, a source the press could work, a person whose indiscretion threatened everyone around her in a situation where indiscretion had become the gravest possible danger. Worse still, her tangled loyalties made her dangerous to all sides at once. As the war between Charles and Diana intensified and the camps began to harden, a person allied with both became suspect to both. Kanga was close to Charles, which made her suspect to Diana's growing faction. She was allied with Diana, which made her suspect to Charles's camp. And she was opposed to Camilla, who was becoming, as the years passed, the steadily more central and more protected figure in Charles's life, the woman who would in the end prevail. In a conflict where everyone was being forced to choose sides, Kanga's refusal or inability to belong cleanly to any one side made her trustworthy to none of them, a woman with a foot in every camp at a moment when each camp wanted absolute loyalty and absolute silence. She had made herself, through her tangled relationships and her loose tongue, a problem for everyone, and in the royal world a problem for everyone is a person who gets removed. The contrast with Camilla, always the key to Kanga's story, grew sharper than ever in these years. As the Charles and Diana marriage collapsed, Camilla's position did not weaken, it strengthened. She remained the constant of the prince's emotional life, the woman he could not give up, and crucially she remained silent throughout, giving the press nothing, maintaining the iron discretion that had always protected her. While Kanga was talking to journalists about comfort stops and feeding the rumour mill that produced the 1987 affair claims, Camilla was saying nothing at all, weathering the gathering storm in perfect silence, protecting her place in Charles's life through the very restraint that Kanga could not manage. The two women's strategies, if Kanga's loose openness can even be called a strategy, were producing opposite results. Camilla's silence was entrenching her. Kanga's talking was exposing her. The gap between them, the gap between the consummate insider and the talented amateur, was widening into the chasm that would separate their final fates. The early 1990s would bring the catastrophe that Kanga's nature had been building toward for years. The War of the Waleses, the open conflict between Charles and Diana, was about to erupt into the public sphere in a series of explosive revelations. Books and tapes and interviews that would tear the royal family's private agony open before the eyes of the world. In that climate of total exposure and total paranoia, the royal world would turn against anyone who could not trust it to keep silent. And Kanga, the woman who had spent years talking to journalists about the prince, was exactly the kind of person it would cast out. The freezing of Camilla Tryon, the cold removal of the vivacious Australian from the inner circle she had spent her life conquering, was about to begin, and it would begin precisely because of the sin she had been committing all along. The sin of talking, the inability to keep the secrets that her place in that world demanded above everything else. How that exclusion unfolded, the exact nature of the indiscretions that finally pushed her beyond forgiveness, and the cold mechanics by which the royal world removed a woman who had been intimate with it for 20 years, is where the story turns next. Because the freezing out of Kanga is the hinge of her whole tragedy, the moment at which the height of her life tipped over into the long descent toward her broken and lonely end, and it was a descent she set in motion herself, with her own voice, in her own inability to stay silent. Every closed world has one rule that matters more than all the others, the rule that defines membership and survival, and in the world of the British monarchy that rule is silence. To understand how Camilla Tryon was destroyed, you have to understand this rule completely, because everything that happened to her flowed from her failure to obey it, and the failure was not an accident or a single misstep, but the steady expression of who she was. The rule is simple to state and merciless in its application. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, whatever you know of the royal family in their private hours, you keep to yourself, always, forever, without exception. The people who surround the monarchy live by this code as an absolute. Courtiers, servants, friends, lovers, the whole circle of those admitted to the inner life of the royals. All of them understand that their access is conditional on their silence, that the price of being trusted with the secrets of that world is to take those secrets to the grave. There is no statute that enforces this rule, no contract that spells it out. It is enforced by something more powerful than law, by the certain knowledge that the person who talks is finished, cut off, removed. That betrayal of the silence is the one offense from which there is no recovery. The royal world can forgive many things. It cannot forgive a person who talks. The reason the rule is so absolute is that the monarchy's survival depends on it. An institution built on mystique and dignity, on the careful management of its image, on the gap between the public spectacle and the private reality, cannot afford to have that gap exposed. The magic of monarchy is a constructed thing, maintained by the suppression of everything that would puncture it, and the people who get close enough to see behind the construction hold, in their knowledge, the power to destroy it. So the institution demands their silence with an intensity that brooks no exception, and it punishes any breach with a ruthlessness designed to deter all the others. The discretion of the royal circle is not mere good manners. It is the immune system of the institution, the mechanism by which the monarchy protects itself from the knowledge held by those it has admitted, and anyone who threatens it is treated as a pathogen to be expelled. Camilla Parker Bowles understood this rule in her bones, and her understanding is the key to her survival and her ultimate triumph. Through all the years of her relationship with Charles, through the rivalries and the marriage and the war and the scandal, Camilla maintained a silence so complete that it became a kind of armor. She never spoke to the press about the prince. She never confirmed, never denied, never shared, never traded on her closeness to him, never gave the journalists a single word they could use. Whatever she knew, and she knew everything, she kept locked away with a discipline that never wavered across decades. That silence protected her absolutely. It made her unassailable, a woman who could not be caught out because she never said anything to be caught out on, and it allowed her to outlast every storm, to survive every scandal, to remain at Charles's side through everything and emerge, in the end, as his wife and his queen. Camilla won the longest game in modern royal history, and she won it with silence. Camilla Tryon could not be silent, and the inability was woven into the deepest part of her nature. She had come from a world where talking was the whole point, the world of journalism and publicity and Australian openness, where being interesting and well-connected and full of good stories was the path to everything she had wanted. She had built her business on her willingness to put her royal connection on display. She counted journalists as friends and trusted them as colleagues. And above all, she needed, in some essential way, to be known as special, to have the world understand how close she was to the prince, to receive the validation that came from her intimacy with the most important man in her life. This need was not a calculated strategy. It was a compulsion, a constitutional incapacity for the silence that her position demanded, and it expressed itself in a steady stream of indiscretions that grew bolder and more dangerous as the years passed. The specific forms her indiscretion took were exactly the kind of thing the royal world could not tolerate. She told favoured journalists, the reporters she trusted and liked, about her relationship with the prince. She described how Charles would telephone her out of the blue, how he would ask whether he might drop by her home in Wiltshire, and she gave these visits a coy and knowing name, calling them comfort stops, a euphemism that suggested everything while stating nothing, the kind of nudging phrase that a journalist could do a great deal with. She painted herself, to the press, as the woman the prince turned to for solace, the one he called when he needed comfort, the keeper of his confidence and his affection. Every such disclosure was a small betrayal of the silence, a handing over to the press of exactly the kind of private detail that the rules forbade absolutely. And the cumulative effect was to mark Kanga, in the eyes of the royal world, as a woman who could not be trusted, a leak, a talker, a danger. There was a detail in her behaviour that captures the whole problem with a single vivid image, and it concerns the prince's letters. Charles had written to Kanga over the years, letters in his distinctive hand, the spidery handwriting that those close to him would have recognized at once. These letters were intimate documents, private correspondence between the prince and the woman he had been close to for so long, and the discreet thing, the only acceptable thing, would have been to keep them hidden, locked away, seen by no one. Kanga did the opposite. According to a family friend, she would leave the prince's letters lying around her home, deliberately, so that visitors would see them and recognize his unmistakable handwriting. She used the letters as a kind of display, a way of showing her guests that she was in correspondence with the Prince of Wales, that she possessed these tangible proofs of her intimacy with him, that she mattered to him enough to receive his private letters. It was the perfect expression of her flaw, the need to be seen as special made physical. The prince's confidence turned into a prop for impressing visitors. The letters that should have been her most carefully guarded secret became, in her hands, an exhibit, and the contrast with Camilla's perfect silence could not have been more complete. Set the two women side by side, and the difference is total, and it is the difference between survival and destruction. Camilla received the prince's love and kept it utterly hidden, never breathing a word, guarding every secret, treating her intimacy with Charles as something to be protected in absolute silence. Kanga received the prince's love and could not stop displaying it, telling journalists about his calls, leaving his letters out for visitors, painting herself to the press as the woman he turned to. Both women were close to Charles. Both held his secrets. One understood that the secrets were the price of admission and kept them faithfully. The other treated the secrets as currency, as validation, as things to be spent on the attention she craved. And the royal world, which watches everything and forgets nothing, registered the difference. Camilla was the woman who could be trusted. Kanga was the woman who could not. And in that world, the woman who cannot be trusted is the woman who gets removed. The cruelty of Kanga's position is that she may not have fully understood what she was doing, or how fatal it was. She had come from outside, an Australian with no bred-in-the-bone training in the codes of the British royal world, and the lessons that Camilla had absorbed in the cradle were lessons Kanga had never been taught. To her, perhaps, talking to friendly journalists about the prince's calls was not a grave betrayal, but a natural pleasure, the kind of thing a well-connected woman did, the harmless sharing of an exciting life. Leaving the letters out was not a security breach, but a small vanity, an understandable wish to show that she mattered. She seems not to have grasped, until far too late, that in the world she had entered these were not small things at all, that they were precisely the offences that ended people, that every word she gave the press and every letter she displayed was building, slowly, the case for her own exclusion. She was committing the cardinal sin without quite knowing it was a sin, breaking the one unbreakable rule because no one had ever made her understand that it was unbreakable, and the punishment was coming whether she understood the crime or not. And the punishment, when it came, would be characteristic of the royal world in its very nature, cold and quiet and deniable. The monarchy does not expel people with announcements or confrontations. It does not issue verdicts or explain itself. It simply withdraws, grows cold, stops the invitations, closes the doors, lets the warmth drain out of a relationship until the person finds themselves outside without ever being told they have been put there. This is how the royal world removes those who have become inconvenient, through a slow freezing rather than a sudden expulsion, a gradual chilling that leaves no fingerprints and admits no blame. The institution can always say it did nothing, that the person simply drifted away, that there was no decision and no rejection, only the natural cooling of a friendship. And the person on the receiving end is left to absorb the loss of their entire world with no explanation, no appeal, no acknowledgement that anything has been done to them at all. This was the fate now closing around Camilla Tryon. The years of indiscretion, the talking to journalists, the comfort stops, the displayed letters, the tabloid affair claims, the tangled loyalties in a world demanding absolute allegiance, all of it had marked her as a woman who could not be trusted, and the royal world was beginning to do what it always does to such people. The warmth was beginning to drain away. The closeness she had enjoyed for 20 years was beginning to cool. The doors that had always been open to her were beginning, quietly and without explanation, to close. The freezing of Kanga had begun, and it would continue, cold and relentless and deniable, until the vivacious Australian, who had been intimate with the royal family for 2 decades, found herself standing entirely outside the world that had been her life. The full unfolding of that exclusion, the cold mechanics of how she was removed, and the devastating effect that the loss of her royal world had on a woman who had built her whole identity around it, is where the story turns next. Because for Kanga, to be frozen out of the royal circle was not merely a social setback. It was the removal of the center of her existence, the loss of the thing that had defined her for 20 years, and the wound it opened in her would never close, would in fact widen into the despair and the illness and the broken body that carried her at last to her early grave. The freezing of Camilla Tryon did not happen on a single day. There was no letter telling her she was no longer welcome, no conversation in which she was informed that her time in the royal world was over, no moment she could point to afterward and say, "That was when they cast me out." There was only the slow withdrawal of warmth, the gradual cooling of a closeness that had lasted 20 years, the quiet draining away of the invitations and the calls and the easy intimacy that had been the center of her life. This is how the royal world removes people, and it is in some ways the cruelest method there is, because it leaves the victim with nothing solid to grieve, no clear injury to protest, only the dawning, devastating understanding that the world they belong to has closed its doors and is never going to open them again. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The world she was being frozen out of had a name by the 1990s, and the name was Highgrove. Highgrove was Charles's country house in Gloucestershire, and around it had formed the circle of friends and intimates who made up the prince's private world, the people he gathered around himself, the set he trusted and relaxed among. To be part of the Highgrove set was to be inside the prince's life at its most personal, admitted to the country weekends and the private gatherings, counted among the small number of people Charles wanted near him. For 20 years, Kanga had been one of those people, intimate with the prince, welcome in his world, a fixture of the life that centered on him, and now, as the 1990s wore on, she found herself increasingly outside it, the warmth gone, the invitations thinning, the doors that had always been open to her quietly closing. The Highgrove set, the circle that had been her world, was becoming a place she no longer belonged. Here honesty requires care, because the question of exactly how Kanga came to be excluded is genuinely contested, and the truth is probably a tangled combination of forces rather than a single clean act of rejection. There are 2 readings of what happened, and both contain truth. The first reading is the one that frames Kanga's exclusion as a punishment, a deliberate removal of a woman who had broken the rules. In this account, drawn out most clearly by the 2008 documentary that examined her life, Kanga committed the cardinal sin of talking about her relationship with the prince to the press, and as a consequence she found herself excluded from the royal circle. The exclusion, in this reading, was the institution doing what it always does to those who breach its silence, freezing out a woman who had become a liability, cutting off the talker to protect the secrets she could no longer be trusted to keep. This is the reading that fits the larger pattern of how the royal world treats indiscretion, and there is real force to it. Kanga had talked, had displayed the letters, had fed the press, had made herself untrustworthy in a world that demands trust above everything, and the cooling of her royal connections followed directly from that. The punishment fit the crime, and the crime was real. The second reading is gentler toward the institution and harder on the cruelty of circumstance, and it too has support. In this account, Kanga's removal from the inner circle was driven not only, or even mainly, by deliberate exclusion, but by the deterioration of her own condition and by a degree of self-withdrawal. By the 1990s, Kanga was becoming a troubled woman, struggling with health problems and with the depression and instability that would eventually overwhelm her, subject to terrible mood swings and to a darkness that made her difficult company. Some accounts suggest that the Highgrove set struggled to cope with her depression and her volatility, that the warmth cooled not from a cold decision to punish her, but from the ordinary human difficulty of being around someone whose suffering had made them hard to be with. And some accounts suggest that Kanga herself, as her troubles deepened, distanced herself from the circle, pulled back from a world she could no longer face with her old confidence, withdrawing as much as she was excluded. In this reading, the tragedy is less a matter of deliberate cruelty than of a woman coming apart and a circle that did not know how to hold her, drifting away from each other as her condition worsened. The truth almost certainly contains both readings, and the combination is its own kind of tragedy. Kanga had committed the sin of indiscretion, and that sin had marked her, had made her less trusted and less welcome, had begun the cooling of her royal connections in a way that fits the institution's pattern of punishing those who talk. And at the same time she was beginning to fall apart, struggling with illness and depression and instability, becoming difficult and volatile, harder to be around, pulling back from a world that was also pulling back from her. The two processes fed each other. Her exclusion deepened her despair, and her despair made her more excluded, the freezing out and the falling apart reinforcing one another in a downward spiral that carried her further and further from the world that had been her life. Whether the institution pushed her or she fell or both happened at once, the result was the same. Kanga was losing the royal world, and the loss was destroying her. What can be said with confidence is that the prince's own account of their relationship, given later, confirms the reality of the distance that had grown between them. According to Tina Brown's book The Palace Papers, Charles released a statement in 1997, in the final period of Kanga's life, which described the state of their friendship in terms that spoke volumes through their very restraint. The prince, the statement indicated, was in touch with Kanga once or twice a year, but they were no longer the close friends they had once been. Read that carefully and weigh it against everything that had gone before. This was the woman Charles had called the only one who ever really understood him, the rival to Camilla for his heart, the godmother close intimate who had stayed in his private homes and sailed on the yachts and been woven into his life for 20 years. And now, at the end, the official word was that he saw her once or twice a year, that the great closeness had faded to an occasional contact, that they were no longer what they had been. The phrase is gentle, even kind, but its meaning is stark. The intimacy was over. The woman who had understood him was now someone he was in touch with once or twice a year. The freezing was complete. To grasp what this loss meant to Kanga, you have to understand that the royal world was not merely one part of her life. It was the center of her identity, the thing she had built her whole self around, and its removal took from her not just a social circle but the core of who she was. Think about what Kanga had made of herself, and on what foundation. She had come from Australia with nothing but her personality, and she had built an entire identity out of her closeness to the royal family. Her title came through a marriage into a family at the heart of the royal household. Her social standing rested on her access to the royals, her place in their private world, her intimacy with the prince. Her business was named after the nickname Charles had given her and built on the publicity her royal connections generated. Her sense of herself as someone special, someone who mattered, someone who had risen far beyond her origins, was bound up entirely with her place in the royal world, and above all with her bond to Charles. She had become Kanga, and Kanga was at her core the woman close to the prince. Remove that, and what was left? The identity she had constructed over 20 years had the royal world as its foundation, and when that foundation was pulled away, the whole structure of her selfhood began to collapse. This is why the freezing out was not, for Kanga, the kind of setback a person can absorb and move on from. For someone whose identity rested on other foundations, the loss of a glamorous social circle would be painful but survivable, a wound that would heal and a life that would continue along other lines. For Kanga, the loss of the royal world was the loss of herself. She had no other foundation to fall back on, no identity independent of her royal closeness that could sustain her once that closeness was gone. The vivacious Australian who had built everything on her place near the prince found that place dissolving, and with it dissolved the very basis of who she was. She was not just being excluded from a circle, she was being unmade, the entire edifice of her identity crumbling as the world it rested on withdrew from her, and the unmaking opened in her a despair that she had no resources to withstand. The despair was deepened by the particular cruelty of how the royal world's withdrawal works, the way it offers no explanation and admits no wrong. Kanga was not told why the warmth had drained away. She was not given a reason, an accusation she could answer, a clear rejection she could rage against, and then begin to recover from. She was left to experience the slow cooling of her entire world, with no acknowledgement that anything was being done to her, no one to blame, nothing solid to grieve. The institution could always maintain that nothing had happened, that there had been no decision, that friendships simply fade, and Kanga was left alone with the bewildering, unbearable experience of watching her life close its doors against her, for reasons no one would name, an exclusion conducted so quietly and so deniably that she could not even be certain it was happening to her until it had already happened. There is a special torment in being destroyed by a force that insists it is doing nothing, and that torment was Kanga's. There is a bitter symbolism, too, in what was happening to her at exactly this moment, because the woman who was being frozen out of the royal world for her own troubles was, at the very same time, giving herself to the cause of helping others with the kind of troubles that were beginning to overwhelm her. Kanga was the chairwoman of SANE, a major mental health charity, lending her name and her energy to the support of people struggling with mental illness. The irony is almost too painful to state. As Kanga publicly championed the cause of mental health, working on behalf of those battling depression and psychological suffering, she was herself descending into exactly that darkness, struggling with a depression that would soon consume her, her own mind beginning to give way under the weight of her losses. The chairwoman of the mental health charity was becoming a casualty of mental illness, the advocate for the suffering becoming one of the suffering, and the world that was freezing her out was watching a woman come apart even as she worked to hold others together. By the early 1990s, then, the shape of Kanga's tragedy was set, and the descent was beginning to accelerate. She was being frozen out of the royal world, losing the center of her identity, falling into a despair she had no foundation to withstand. The cardinal sin had been committed, and the punishment was underway, tangled together with her own deterioration in a spiral that fed on itself. And into this already collapsing life, the next blows were about to fall. Blows not of the social and emotional kind that had begun her unraveling, but of the physical kind, the brutal return of illness to a body that had been marked by affliction since childhood. The woman who had spent her life in furious movement was about to be attacked by her own flesh, struck by cancer, driven into dependency, and finally broken by a fall that would take from her the use of her legs and leave her, at the end, as motionless as the child she had once been, strapped in irons in a Melbourne hospital. How the physical catastrophe unfolded The cancer and the dependency and the deepening illness that consumed the last years of her life is where the story turns next. Because the freezing out had broken Kanga's world, but it was her body in the end that would break Kanga, and the manner of that breaking is the darkest part of a story that had already grown very dark indeed. The body that carried Camilla Tryon through her glamorous years had never been whole, and as the 1990s opened it began, with a terrible thoroughness, to fail her. She had entered the world with a spine marked by spina bifida, and had spent her childhood fighting Perthes disease, locked in irons while the bone in her hip slowly rebuilt itself. She had escaped all of that, or seemed to, building a life of furious movement on a foundation her own flesh had compromised from the start. And now, as her royal world withdrew from her and her identity began to crumble, the old vulnerability of her body reasserted itself, and the affliction that had bracketed her childhood returned to bracket her death. The recurrence of her childhood disease was the first sign that her body was turning against her again. The conditions that had marked her early years, the trouble in her bones and her spine, came back to trouble her in middle age, the structural weaknesses she had carried all her life beginning to tell as she entered her 40s. A body that had been compromised from birth does not always hold up under the long strain of the years, and Kanga's was beginning to break down, the early affliction returning to claim a woman who had spent decades outrunning it. The vivacious energy that had defined her, the appetite for movement that had carried her out of the hospital ward and across the world, was beginning to be ground down by a body that could no longer keep pace with her will. Then came the blow that turned deterioration into catastrophe. In 1993, Kanga was diagnosed with cancer of the uterus. A cancer diagnosis is a devastation for anyone, and for Kanga it landed at the worst possible moment, into a life already coming apart at the seams. She was losing her royal world, sinking into the despair that the loss had opened, struggling with the return of her old physical troubles, and now she faced a malignancy in her own body, a cancer that threatened her life directly, and that would require the brutal treatments that cancer demands. The disease attacked her at a time when she had the least reserves to fight it, when the emotional foundations that might have sustained her through such an ordeal had already been pulled away. She fought the cancer, and in the immediate sense she won, by surviving the disease, beating the immediate threat to her life. But the victory came at a cost that would prove, in the end, as deadly as the cancer itself, because the treatment that saved her from the disease delivered her into the dependency that would help to destroy her. The path from cancer treatment to dependency is a well-worn and tragic one, and Kanga walked it to its bitter end. The treatment of serious illness, the surgeries and the aftermath, the chronic pain that such conditions and their treatments leave behind, frequently requires powerful pain-killing drugs, and those drugs are powerfully addictive. Kanga, in the wake of her cancer and the affliction of her failing body, became dependent on painkillers, the medications prescribed to manage the pain of her illness, taking hold of her as they take hold of so many, the relief they offered shading into a need she could not break. And alongside the painkillers came alcohol, the second crutch of those in chronic physical and emotional pain. The two dependencies compounding each other, the drink and the drugs together, pulling her down into a chemical dependency that overlaid and deepened the despair already consuming her. The woman who had once sailed the Mediterranean on billionaires' yachts was becoming a woman dependent on painkillers and alcohol, her body broken by illness and her mind clouded by the substances she used to bear it. The despair that ran beneath all of this was deepening into something with a clinical name, and it was the most dangerous of all her afflictions. Kanga was sinking into a depressive illness, a darkness that went beyond ordinary sadness into the realm of genuine mental illness, a condition that would eventually be severe enough to lead to her being detained under the law. The losses had piled upon her, the royal world gone, the identity crumbling, the body failing, the cancer, the dependency, and beneath them all her mind was giving way, the vivacious spirit that had defined her whole life draining out of her, replaced by a depression that those around her could see and that she could not escape, the joie de vivre that family and friends had always described. The sheer delight in being alive that had been her signature since girlhood was being extinguished, and what was taking its place was a darkness as deep as any she had ever known. And here the cruelest irony of her whole life reached its full and terrible expression. Because the woman descending into this depression was, at the very same time, the public champion of the mentally ill. Kanga was the chairwoman of SANE, one of Britain's major mental health charities, an organisation dedicated to supporting people suffering from mental illness and to changing the way society understood and treated psychological suffering. She had taken on this role, lent her name and her energy and her public profile to the cause, become a visible advocate for those battling the very conditions that were now overwhelming her. Picture the agony of it. As Kanga stood before the public as a champion of mental health, working on behalf of the depressed and the suffering, she was herself falling into exactly that suffering, her own mind collapsing under the weight of her losses, even as she worked to help others bear the same collapse. The advocate was becoming the patient. The woman who lent her name to the cause of the mentally ill was becoming one of the mentally ill, descending into a depression severe enough to consume her, all while maintaining, for as long as she could, her public role as a source of help and hope for others in the grip of the darkness that was claiming her. There is something almost unbearable in the gap between the public face and the private reality in this period of Kanga's life, and it speaks to a courage in her that should not be overlooked even amid the tragedy. She kept going. She maintained her charitable work, her public commitments, the appearance of a functioning life, even as her body failed and her mind darkened and her dependencies tightened their grip. The woman who had spent her life refusing to be still, refusing to be small, refusing to surrender to the afflictions that had marked her since childhood, brought that same refusal to her final years, struggling to keep her footing, to maintain her dignity, to go on being Kanga, even as everything that had made her Kanga was stripped away. There is a kind of heroism in that struggle, a last expression of the fearless spirit that had always defined her, even though the struggle was one she was destined to lose. But the marriage that had carried her into this world was failing alongside everything else, and its collapse removed one of the last supports that might have steadied her. The union between Kanga and Anthony Tryon had been troubled for decades. A marriage, she had realized, was doomed within 4 months of the wedding, a framework within which two people had lived increasingly separate lives for the better part of 25 years. Through all the years of her glamour and success, the failing marriage had at least endured in form, providing a structure, a title, a household, a degree of stability beneath the surface unhappiness. Now, as Kanga descended into illness and dependency and depression, even that hollow structure began to give way. The marriage that had survived in form for so long was moving toward its final dissolution, and its end would come at the very worst moment, in the final year of Kanga's life, when she had the least strength to bear another loss. The husband, who had been a distant and disappointing partner for decades, was about to deliver one of the final blows, and his withdrawal would strip away one of the last things Kanga had left, the marriage that, for all its failures, had been part of the structure of her life since 1973. By the middle of the 1990s, then, Kanga Tryon was a woman besieged on every front, her life collapsing in every dimension at once. Her royal world had frozen her out, taking with it the center of her identity. Her body had been attacked by the return of her childhood afflictions and by cancer, and had been left dependent on painkillers and alcohol by the treatment that saved her. Her mind was sinking into a depression severe and deepening. Her marriage was disintegrating toward its final end. The vivacious, glamorous, successful woman of the 1980s, the intimate of royalty, and the businesswoman and the friend of princesses, had become a woman fighting for her life on every level, her world gone, her body broken, her mind darkening, her marriage failing, the whole edifice of her existence crumbling around her at once. The girl who had escaped the hospital ward and conquered London and risen to the heights of the royal world was being brought down, comprehensively and mercilessly, by the combined assault of every kind of affliction at the same time. And the worst was still to come. For all the catastrophes that had already befallen her, the final and most devastating blow had not yet fallen, the blow that would take from her the use of her legs and leave her, at the very end of her life, as motionless as the child she had once been. In the search for help with her dependencies, Kanga would enter a clinic, and within that clinic, something would happen that would shatter her body completely. and seal her fate, a fall from a window whose true nature has never been established, an event surrounded by questions that have never been answered, a catastrophe that would transform the woman who had spent her life in furious movement into a paraplegic who would never walk again. How that final catastrophe unfolded, what is known and what remains uncertain about the fall that broke her, and how the last chapter of her physical destruction began, is where the story turns next. It is the darkest part of a dark story, and it must be approached with care, because the questions it raises have never been resolved, and the woman at its center deserves to have her final ordeal told with honesty about how much we do not and cannot know. By 1996, Kanga Tryon's dependency on painkillers had become serious enough to require treatment, and she did the responsible thing, the thing that should have been the beginning of her recovery. She checked herself into a clinic. The place was Farm Place, a residential facility in Surrey, specializing in the treatment of alcohol and drug dependency, the kind of clinic where people go to break the grip of the substances that have taken hold of them, to dry out, to detoxify, to begin the long climb back toward health. Kanga went there to deal with her dependence on the painkillers that had taken root in the wake of her cancer treatment, seeking help for one of the many afflictions that had piled upon her, taking a step that, in a less doomed life, would have marked a turning toward the light. It marked instead the threshold of the final catastrophe. Because it was within the walls of that clinic, the place she had gone to get better, that the event occurred which would destroy what remained of her body and seal the last chapter of her life. While she was a patient at Farm Place, Kanga fell from a window. The bare facts of the fall are terrible enough. She went out of a first-floor window of the clinic and fell to the ground, and the injuries she suffered were catastrophic. She broke her back. She fractured her skull. The fall shattered her spine in a way that could not be repaired, and when the immediate danger to her life had passed, the lasting damage was revealed in its full horror. Kanga was paralysed. The fall had taken from her the use of her legs, leaving her a paraplegic, unable to walk, confined for whatever remained of her life to a wheelchair. The woman who had spent her entire existence in furious, defiant movement, who had escaped the irons of her childhood and run at the world with an appetite that never flagged, was returned, by that fall, to the very stillness she had spent her life fleeing. The symmetry of it is almost too cruel to contemplate. She had begun her life locked motionless in a hospital, her legs held rigid in metal, and now, near the end of it, she was locked motionless again, her legs dead beneath her, the fearless mover stilled at last by her own broken spine. And here the story enters territory where honesty demands the admission of how much we do not know, because the true nature of that fall has never been established, and it remains one of the genuine unresolved questions of Kanga's life. There are, broadly, three possibilities that have been raised about the fall, and the truth of which one is correct has never been determined. The first is that it was an accident, a terrible mishap, a woman in a fragile physical and mental state falling from a window through misfortune, rather than intent. The second is that it was an attempt by Kanga to take her own life, an act of self-destruction by a woman sunk in a depression so deep that she could no longer bear to live, the fall a deliberate attempt to end the suffering that had piled upon her from every direction. The third, raised in some accounts and given voice in at least one British documentary, is the most disturbing of all. The suggestion that she was pushed, that someone else was responsible for her going out of that window, that the fall was not misfortune or self-harm, but the act of another hand. These are the three possibilities, and they could hardly be more different in their meaning, ranging from blameless accident to private despair to something far darker, and the plain and unsatisfying truth is that no one has ever been able to say with certainty which of them is correct. It is important to be honest and careful here, and not to pretend to a knowledge that does not exist. The sensational possibility, the suggestion that Kanga was pushed, that her fall was the result of foul play, has been raised, but it has never been established, never proven, never supported by anything that would allow it to be stated as fact. It belongs to the realm of speculation and of the darker theories that gather around the unexplained deaths and injuries of people connected to the famous and the powerful, and to present it as truth would be a betrayal of honesty. Equally, the possibility that the fall was a suicide attempt, while consistent with the depth of Kanga's documented depression, has never been confirmed, and to assert it definitively would be to claim a certainty about her inner state in that moment that no one can honestly possess. What can be said is that Kanga was a woman in a severe depressive illness, in a clinic for dependency, in a state of profound suffering, and that she fell from a window and was gravely and permanently injured. Beyond those facts, the truth dissolves into questions that have never been answered, and the only honest course is to hold those questions open rather than to resolve them falsely in favor of whichever theory makes the better story. What is beyond question is the effect of the fall, which was total and irreversible. Kanga was now paraplegic, her body broken, her independence gone, her life transformed in an instant from the troubled existence of a depressed and dependent woman into the far more constrained existence of a woman who could not walk, who needed help with the most basic functions of daily life, whose physical world had contracted to what could be reached from a wheelchair. For a woman whose entire identity had been built on movement, on energy, on the vivacious physical presence that had carried her through life, this was a devastation almost beyond imagining. The very essence of who Kanga had been, the bouncing, irrepressible energy that had earned her the nickname Kanga in the first place, the appetite for motion that had defined her since she escaped the irons of her childhood, was extinguished by the fall. She was Kanga, still in name, but the kangaroo could no longer move, and the cruelty of that, for her, must have been a torment beyond what any words can convey. There is a detail from this period, a glimpse of her in her wheelchair, that captures both the diminishment and the indomitable spirit that survived it, and it deserves to be recorded because it shows that even broken, even destroyed, something of the old Kanga endured. An account from these final years describes her propelling her wheelchair through the dining room of a hotel, and of the reaction she drew. The waiters, immune to the demands of the tycoons and millionaires they served every day, hovered around her, beaming with affection. The maitre d' came to extend a personal welcome. The artist David Hockney crossed the room to pay his respects at her table. The pianist asked whether there was anything she would like him to play, and she requested the Teddy Bear's Picnic, noting that it was Princess Margaret's favourite tune, a small flash of the royal intimacy that had defined her, offered with the old knowing charm. Even in a wheelchair, even at the depth of her ruin, Kanga could still command the affection of a room, still draw people to her with the warmth that had always been her gift, still carry herself with the spirit that had made her who she was. The body was broken, but the charm survived, and that survival, in its way, makes the tragedy of her ruin sharper rather than softer, because it shows what was being destroyed, the vivid, magnetic, irreplaceable spirit that even catastrophe could not entirely extinguish. But the catastrophe was not finished with her, and the fall was not the end of her suffering. It was rather the beginning of the final descent, the event that broke her body and set in motion the last and worst year of her life. Because the fall left her not only paralysed, but more vulnerable than ever to the forces that had been destroying her, her body now broken as well as ill, her independence gone, her despair surely deepened by the loss of her mobility, her whole situation more desperate and more precarious than it had ever been. A woman who had been struggling on every front was now struggling from a wheelchair, with a broken back and a fractured skull, with everything that had been hard before now harder, everything that had been precarious now more precarious still. The fall had not killed her, but it had broken her in a way that left her with almost nothing to withstand the blows that were still to come. And the blows were coming, gathering for the final year of her life, 1997, the year that would bring the end. In that year, Kanga would be detained under the Mental Health Act, sectioned as her depressive illness reached its crisis. In that year, her husband would finally divorce her, stripping away the marriage that had been part of her life for nearly 25 years. In that year, her financial world would close in around her. In that year, too, the world would be convulsed by the death of another woman in Charles's life, Princess Diana, killed in Paris in circumstances that gripped the entire planet, her death casting its vast shadow over the final months of Kanga's own dying. And at the end of that year, in November 1997, Kanga herself would die of blood poisoning following a minor operation, her broken body finally giving out, her long ordeal finally over, Her death barely noticed by a country still mourning the other, more famous woman who had gone before her. The fall from the window at Farm Place was the hinge of the final catastrophe, the event that took the use of her legs and left her broken for the last act of her life. The questions it raised have never been answered, and in honesty they cannot be. The true nature of that fall lost in the fog of an unresolved past, a mystery that hangs over Kanga's story and will likely hang over it forever. What is certain is that after the fall, Kanga was a paraplegic, her body shattered, her life entering its final and darkest phase, the phase that would carry her, in the space of a single terrible year, to her death. How that final year unfolded, the sectioning and the divorce and the financial ruin, the strange shadow of Diana's death, the missing royal letters, and the lonely end in a London hospital, is where the story turns next. It is the last chapter of Kanga's life, and it is as bleak as anything that came before, the final closing in of every kind of darkness on a woman who had once been the brightest light in every room she entered. The reason the questions have never been settled tells its own story about the world Kanga inhabited, and about how the unexplained misfortunes of those near the powerful are allowed to remain unexplained. A fall like Kanga's, suffered by an ordinary person in ordinary circumstances, would ordinarily produce a clear account, a medical record, an inquiry, a settled understanding of what had happened and why. But Kanga was not an ordinary person in ordinary circumstances. She was a woman whose name was bound to the Prince of Wales, who had been intimate with the royal family for 20 years, whose very existence touched on matters the establishment preferred to keep out of the light. And around such people, the machinery of discretion operates even in disaster, the instinct to manage and to minimize, and to keep things quiet, extending even to the catastrophes that befall them. There was no great public reckoning with what had happened to Kanga at that clinic, no determined effort to establish the truth and lay it before the world. Only the same quiet closing over that had characterized her exclusion, the same drawing of a veil that left the facts obscured and the questions open. Into that vacuum, inevitably, the theories rushed, because a vacuum of fact is always filled by speculation, and the darker the surrounding circumstances, the darker the speculation becomes. Kanga had been frozen out by the royal world. She possessed private letters from the prince. She knew things, had been close to the center of secrets the establishment guarded fiercely. And now she had gone out of a window in mysterious circumstances and been left broken, and in time dead. To a certain cast of mind, the ingredients were irresistible, and the suggestion of foul play, of a woman who knew too much being silenced, took shape in exactly the way such suggestions always take shape around the deaths and injuries of those connected to power. It must be said plainly that this is how conspiracy theories are born, in the gap between what is known and what is hidden, and that the existence of such theories is not evidence that they are true. The honest position is not that Kanga was silenced, for which there is no proof, but that the secrecy and the discretion that surrounded her, even in catastrophe, created the very conditions in which the belief that she had been silenced could flourish. The establishment's instinct for quiet did not necessarily harm her at that window, but it ensured that the truth of what happened there would never be clearly told, and that her fall would pass into the realm of the permanently unexplained, where it remains. The year 1997 was the year everything ended for Camilla Tryon, and it ended not all at once but in a series of blows, each landing on a woman who had less and less left to absorb them. She entered that year already broken, paralysed from the fall at Farm Place, sunk in a depressive illness, dependent and despairing, frozen out of the royal world that had been her life. She would not survive the year. Before it was out, she would be detained against her will, divorced by her husband, ruined in her finances, overshadowed by the death of a more famous woman, and finally dead herself, her long ordeal closing in a hospital bed in November. The last year of Kanga's life was a procession of final losses, the systematic stripping away of everything that remained to her, and it is a bleak thing to follow, because there is no recovery in it, no turning, no mercy, only the steady closing of the dark. The first blow of that final year came in June, and it was the loss of her liberty. Kanga was sectioned under the Mental Health Act, detained for a period of 28 days. The phrase carries a weight that is easy to pass over, so it is worth being clear about what it meant. To be sectioned is to be detained against one's will, held in a psychiatric facility under the authority of the law, deprived of the freedom to leave, because one's mental state is judged to present a danger to oneself or to others. It is among the most serious interventions a society can make in an individual's life, the legal removal of a person's liberty on the grounds of mental illness, and it is not done lightly. For Kanga to be sectioned meant that her depressive illness had reached a crisis severe enough to warrant her detention, that those responsible for her care had judged her to be in such a state that she could not safely be left at liberty. The vivacious woman who had charmed the royal family and sailed on billionaires' yachts was now a woman detained under the Mental Health Act, held against her will, her depression so grave that the law had stepped in to confine her. It was a measure of how far she had fallen and of how dark her final months had become. There is once again the unbearable irony of her position, sharpened now to its finest point. Kanga had been the chairwoman of SANE, a mental health charity, a public advocate for those suffering from mental illness, and now she herself was being detained under the very law that governs the treatment of the severely mentally ill. The champion of the cause had become its casualty in the most literal and legal sense, sectioned, confined, treated as a danger to herself. The advocate for the suffering now numbered among the most acutely suffering of all. The woman who had lent her name to the support of the mentally ill ended her life as a patient detained under mental health law, and the distance between those two roles, the public champion and the sectioned patient, measures the depth of the tragedy that had overtaken her. The second blow came in September, and it severed one of the last ties that had structured her life. On the 2nd of September 1997, Kanga's marriage to Anthony Tryon ended in divorce. The union had been troubled for the better part of 25 years. A marriage she had known was doomed within months of the wedding, a hollow framework within which two people had long led separate lives. But it had endured in form, providing a title, a household, a structure, a place in the world. And now, in the final year of Kanga's life, at the moment of her greatest weakness and need, it was formally dissolved. The timing of it is hard to absorb. Kanga was paralysed, sectioned, sunk in despair, broken on every front, and it was at this moment that her husband divorced her, the legal end of the marriage falling on a woman who was already destroyed, stripping away one of the last fixed points in a life that had lost nearly everything else. Whatever the reasons, whatever the long history of unhappiness that lay behind it, the divorce removed from Kanga, at the very end, the marriage that had been part of her identity since 1973, leaving her more alone than she had ever been. The financial ruin came alongside these other losses, completing the destruction of the material world she had built. The fashion business that had been her own great achievement, the Kanga label that had thrived in the 1980s, did not survive her decline, and her financial situation collapsed along with everything else. The woman who had built a successful international business, who had moved through a world of yachts and wealth and privilege, faced, at the end, the closing in of financial trouble, the loss of the means and the security she had once commanded. The collapse was of a piece with everything else that was happening to her, the material foundations of her life crumbling alongside the physical and the emotional and the social, every kind of security stripped away at once, leaving her with nothing solid to stand on in any dimension of her existence. And over the final months of Kanga's dying fell a vast and terrible shadow, the shadow of another woman's death, a death that convulsed the entire world and that bound itself in the strangest way to the story of Kanga's own end. On the 31st of August, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car crash in Paris. The death of Diana was one of the great public events of the century, a global convulsion of grief on a scale that had no modern precedent, the whole world stopping to mourn the most famous woman of the age, cut down at 36 in the tunnel beneath the Pont de l'Alma. Britain entered a period of national mourning unlike anything in living memory. The streets filled with flowers, the public consumed by sorrow and anger, the monarchy itself shaken to its foundations by the force of the reaction. For weeks, the death of Diana was the only thing the country could think about, the only story, the only grief, an event so enormous that it blotted out everything else. And in the shadow of that enormous grief, Camilla Tryon lay dying, another woman in Charles's life, in her own quiet catastrophe, entirely overshadowed. Consider the strange and painful symmetry. Here were two women, both bound to Prince Charles, both central in their different ways to his emotional history, both of them dying in the same few months of the same year. Diana, the wife, killed in Paris in August, mourned by the entire world. Kanga, the confidant and former love, dying slowly in England, noticed by almost no one. The contrast between their deaths is a final, brutal illustration of everything that had separated their fates. Diana died as the most famous woman on earth, her passing a global event. Kanga died in obscurity, her long ordeal invisible against the blaze of the world's grief for the other woman. Two women who had loved the same man, two women who had even at one point allied against Camilla, dying in the same season, one of them the center of the world's attention, the other forgotten in the corner of a story that had no room left for her. There is, in this period, one final detail that touches on the central mystery of Kanga's life, the matter of the prince's letters, and it adds a last note of the strange and the unresolved to her ending. Kanga had treasured the letters Charles had written her over the years, the private correspondence in his distinctive hand that she had once left lying around for visitors to admire. These letters were, in a sense, the physical proof of her whole story, the tangible evidence of her intimacy with the prince, the documents that testified to what she had been to him. And in the final period of her life, at a time when she was, by the account of a family friend, in despair and confusion, the letters went missing. They disappeared. The proof of her closeness to Charles, the cache of his private letters, vanished in her last days, and no one could say with certainty what had become of them. One theory, offered by a family friend, was that Anthony, her husband, who had always known about the relationship, had posted them back to Charles, returning the prince's correspondence to its author. But the letters could be anywhere, the friend acknowledged, and they did not turn up in the family's possessions afterward. The letters that had testified to Kanga's place in the prince's life vanished as she herself was vanishing, the documentary evidence of her story disappearing alongside the woman, adding one more unanswered question to a life that ended in so many. And then, on the 15th of November 1997, Camilla Tryon died. She died at King Edward VII's Hospital in London. The official cause of her death was septicemia, blood poisoning, an infection in the blood that overwhelmed her broken body. It had followed, by various accounts, a minor operation, the kind of routine procedure that should not have been fatal, but Kanga's body, broken by the fall, weakened by years of illness and dependency and depression, ravaged by everything that had befallen her, could not withstand the infection. She was 49 years old. The woman who had been born in Melbourne with such an outsized portion of energy and life, who had escaped the irons of her childhood and conquered London and risen to the heights of the royal world, who had been the only woman, by the prince's own account, who ever really understood him, died of blood poisoning in a London hospital at 49, paralysed, divorced, sectioned, frozen out, her business gone, her letters vanished, her death barely noticed by a country still mourning Diana. The bleakness of that ending is hard to overstate, and it deserves to be felt fully rather than softened. Kanga died, having lost everything she had built and everything she had been. The royal world that had been the centre of her identity had frozen her out. The body that had carried her through her glamorous life had been broken and paralysed. The mind that had blazed with such vivacity had darkened into a depression severe enough to have her detained under law. The marriage that had structured her life for 25 years had been dissolved. The business that had been her own achievement had collapsed. The man she had loved, the prince who had called her the only one who understood him, was in touch with her by the official word once or twice a year, and she died in the shadow of another woman's death, overshadowed even in her dying, forgotten even at the end, her passing a footnote to the great grief that was consuming the country. The brightest light in every room she had ever entered went out in a hospital bed at 49, with almost no one watching. She was, in the end, the woman who had got too close to the crown and paid for it, though the payment had been extracted not in a single dramatic stroke but in the slow, comprehensive destruction of a life across years of mounting catastrophe. The closeness to Charles that had been the glory of her life had also been, in a sense, the engine of her ruin, drawing her into a world whose rules she could not keep, whose discretion she could not maintain, whose protection was reserved for others and never extended to her. She had been let into that world for her warmth and her brightness, and she had been destroyed, in part, by the very qualities that had let her in: the openness, the need to be seen, the inability to keep the secrets that her place demanded. She had wanted to be known as special, and she had been, and the knowledge had cost her everything. What her death meant, what it revealed about the world that had used and discarded her, how it sat within the larger pattern of the women in Charles's life, and how the woman who could not keep silent was written out of the story, while the woman who kept every secret became queen, is where the story comes to its close. Because the final reckoning of Kanga's life is not only the catalogue of her losses but the meaning of them, the lesson her fate teaches about the royal world and about the price it exacts from those who get too close, and that reckoning is where the story must end. The meaning of it all, and the final verdict on the woman and the world that destroyed her, is where we go now. It is worth pausing on what a sectioning of this kind would have done to a woman like Kanga, because the loss of liberty was not merely a procedural event, but a wound to the very core of who she had always been. Remember the child locked in irons in the Melbourne hospital, immobilized for years, and remember the woman that child became, the one who answered her early confinement with a lifelong refusal to be held still or shut in anywhere. Freedom of movement, the ability to come and go, to fill a room and then sweep out of it, to be unconfined, had been the organizing principle of Kanga's whole existence, the thing she had fought for since girlhood. And now, at the end, she was confined again, detained against her will, deprived of the liberty she had spent her life insisting upon, held in a facility she could not leave. The body had already been locked by the fall, the legs stilled beneath her. Now the law locked the rest of her, removing even the freedom to walk out of a door, had she been able to walk at all. For a woman whose entire identity had been built on movement and freedom and the refusal of confinement, to be sectioned was to suffer the precise negation of everything she had ever been, the final closing of every door, the last and most complete return of the stillness she had spent a lifetime fleeing. There was a terrible completeness to it, the fearless mover detained by law, the woman who could not be held still at last by every force there was, her body and her liberty alike taken from her in the same dark season. And there is a question that hangs over the sectioning, as it hangs over so much of her final year, the question of where the people of her old world were while this happened to her. Kanga had been intimate with the royal family for 20 years, a regular guest in their private homes. The woman the prince had called, the only one who understood him. She had moved among the wealthiest and most powerful people in Britain, counted princesses and tycoons and famous artists among her acquaintance. And yet, in the final year of her life, as she was paralysed and sectioned and divorced and ruined, the great world she had belonged to was simply not there. The yachts and the palaces and the country weekends had receded into a past that no longer had any bearing on her, and the woman who had once been at the centre of that glittering world faced its final cruelties largely without it. This is what the freezing out had meant in the end. Not merely the loss of invitations and warmth in the years of her decline, but the absence of that whole world at the moment of her greatest need, the silence where the royal circle had once been, the doors that had closed in the good years staying closed through the worst year of all. The vanishing of the letters carries a meaning that goes beyond the simple mystery of their whereabouts, because of what those letters represented and what their disappearance accomplished. They were, as much as anything could be, the proof of Kanga's story. In a life whose central claim, her deep importance to the Prince of Wales, had always been partly denied, partly hidden, partly dismissed as the exaggeration of an indiscreet woman, the letters were the hard evidence, the physical testimony in the prince's own hand, that the closeness had been real, that she had mattered to him, that the story she told about herself was true. They were the documents that could have spoken for her after she was gone, the record that might have secured her place in the history of the man she had loved. And they disappeared at the precise moment when she could no longer protect them, in the confusion and despair of her final days. Whatever the innocent explanation, and the theory that her husband returned them to Charles may well be the whole of it, the effect was the same as if it had been designed. The proof of Kanga's intimacy with the prince vanished, and with it vanished much of her ability to assert her own significance from beyond the grave. The story could now be told, or left untold, without the inconvenience of the letters to anchor it. Kanga's version of her life, the version in which she had been central to the prince, lost its documentary spine at the very moment she lost her own voice in death. There is no need to invent a conspiracy to feel the weight of this, the way the evidence of a woman's importance dissolved exactly as she did, leaving her story to survive, if it survived at all, on the word of a woman the world had already learned to discount. The letters had once been her proof and her vanity both, the things she displayed to show how special she was. In the end they were gone, and her specialness went with them, and the woman who had wanted more than anything to be known as close to the prince was left, in death, without even the letters to testify that she had been. It is a fitting final loss, in its way the most complete of all. She had lost her world, her body, her mind's peace, her marriage, her business, her place in the prince's life. And at the last, she lost even the evidence that any of it had been what she said it was, the proof of her story slipping away into the same fog of the unexplained that had swallowed the truth of her fall. She died not only stripped of everything she had built, but stripped, too, of the means to prove she had ever built it, her testimony gone, her letters gone, her story left to the mercy of a world that had every reason to forget her, and few reasons to remember. 2 women who had loved the same man died in the autumn of 1997, 10 weeks apart, and the gap between how the world received those 2 deaths is the truest measure of everything this story has tried to say. Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed on the 31st of August, and the planet stopped. An ocean of flowers rose against the railings of the royal palaces. Millions wept for a woman most of them had never met. The monarchy itself was shaken to its foundations by the sheer force of the grief, forced to bend in ways it had never bent before, the Queen herself compelled to come down from Balmoral and bow her head to a sorrow she could not control. And then on the 15th of November, in a London hospital, Camilla Tryon died of blood poisoning at 49, and the country that had drowned in grief for one woman barely turned its head for the other. The same man stood at the edge of both deaths. The world mourned one of them as a saint and forgot the other within a news cycle, and the difference between those 2 fates is not an accident of fame. It is the whole lesson, written in the starkest possible terms across a single terrible season. What that lesson amounts to, what Kanga's life and death actually reveal about the world that used and discarded her, is the question this final reckoning has to answer. Because it would be easy and false to reduce her story to a single villain or a single crime, to say that the palace killed her, or that Charles destroyed her, or that some conspiracy reached into a clinic and pushed her from a window. The truth is more tangled than that, and more damning in a quieter way, and getting it right matters more than reaching for the dramatic answer. Kanga was destroyed by many things at once, some of them nobody's fault, some of them her own, and some of them belonging to the institution and the world she had given her life to. Untangling which is the only honest way to close her story, and it begins with the one comparison that runs through everything. The comparison between the woman who died forgotten and the woman who became queen. Camilla Parker Bowles is the answer to the question of what Kanga might have been, and the contrast between them is the closest thing this story has to a moral. The 2 women began in nearly the same place. Both were close to Charles in the 1970s, when he was single and the question of his future wife hung open. Both were judged unsuitable to marry him, ruled out by the same cold establishment calculus that valued breeding and a spotless reputation above love or understanding. Both married other men in 1973, taking themselves off the board as potential royal brides while remaining bound to the prince in ways that would shape the rest of their lives. They started, in other words, as equals in the prince's affection and equals in their exclusion from the role of his wife, 2 women he wanted and could not have, 2 intimates consigned to the margins of his official life. And then their paths diverged so completely that one of them ended as Queen of the United Kingdom and the other ended as a footnote. And the thing that divided them was not luck and not the prince's preference, but a single quality of character. Camilla could keep silent. Kanga could not understand what Camilla's silence actually cost her and demanded of her, because the discipline of it was extraordinary and the temptation to break it must have been immense. For decades, Camilla occupied the most painful position imaginable. She was the woman the future king loved, and she had to watch him marry someone else. Had to stand by while the world celebrated his fairy tale wedding to a younger and more beautiful bride. Had to endure being the secret, the hidden one, the woman whose existence was denied and concealed. When the truth of the marriage's collapse finally erupted into public, Camilla became, for a time, very nearly the most hated woman in Britain, cast in the public mind as the villain who had destroyed Diana's marriage and ruined the people's princess. She was vilified, mocked, blamed, treated as the wrecker of the nation's romantic dream. And through all of it, through the decades of waiting and the years of public hatred, she said nothing. She gave the press no interviews, made no defense of herself, told no one her side, maintained an absolute silence that never once cracked under pressures that would have broken almost anyone. She simply endured, year after year, keeping every secret, weathering every storm in total quiet, playing the longest and most disciplined waiting game in modern royal history. And the silence was rewarded, in the end, beyond anything she could have dreamed. The hatred faded. The public, over years, came gradually to accept her. Charles never let her go, and the institution, slowly and carefully, brought her in from the cold, rehabilitated her, made her first his acknowledged partner and then his wife. When Charles married Camilla in 2005, the woman who had been the third person in his marriage to Diana, the secret and the scandal and the hated rival, was made his legitimate consort. And when he became king in 2022, Camilla became queen, crowned beside him, the highest position a woman can hold in the British system, the very throne that the suitable bride Diana had been chosen to fill. The unsuitable woman, the one the establishment had ruled out in the 1970s, ended up exactly where the rules had said she could never go, and she got there by outlasting everyone, by enduring everything, by keeping silent through it all. Camilla won completely and finally, and she won with discretion. Now set Kanga beside that, and the lesson is unmistakable and merciless. Kanga had the same starting hand. She was close to the prince, beloved by him, called the only one who understood him, a rival to Camilla herself in the years when the prince's heart was still open. Had she possessed Camilla's discipline, her capacity for silence, her understanding that invisibility was the price of permanence, who can say what her place in his life might have become? What protection the institution might have extended to her? How differently her decline might have been met? But Kanga could not be silent. She talked to journalists about the prince's calls and his comfort stops. She left his letters out for visitors to see. She advertised her closeness to him, traded on it, built a business on it, needed the world to know how special she was. And the royal world, which had rewarded Camilla's silence with a crown, punished Kanga's talking with exile and abandonment. The same institution that protected the woman who kept its secrets discarded the woman who could not. And the difference in their fates, the throne against the unmarked obscurity, came down to that one thing. Silence was survival. Talking was death. Camilla understood it. Kanga never could. This is the first and hardest truth of Kanga's story, and it is a truth about the royal world's deepest nature. That world runs on discretion the way a body runs on blood, and it enforces the rule of silence with a ruthlessness that admits no exception, offers no mercy to those who break it. It will forgive a great deal. It forgave Camilla her decades as the other woman, forgave her the destruction of a beloved marriage, forgave her the role of national villain, and raised her to a throne. What it will not forgive, ever, is a person who talks, because talking threatens the one thing the institution cannot survive without, the control of its own secrets, the management of its own image, the gap between the public pageant and the private truth. Kanga threatened that, again and again, with every indiscretion, and so the world that had crowned the silent woman cast out the talking one, and the casting out was the beginning of her ruin. But the comparison with Camilla, sharp as it is only one part of the larger pattern, because Kanga was not the only woman in Charles's orbit to be used and damaged by the institution, and her fate sits within a wider history of women sacrificed to the needs of the crown. Look at the pattern across the women in this prince's life, and a grim consistency emerges. Diana herself was a kind of sacrifice, chosen not for love but for suitability, selected because she met the establishment's checklist, married into a union her husband's heart had no room for, used to provide the air and the image the institution required, and then left to suffer in a marriage crowded by another woman until she came apart. Diana was destroyed by the gap between what she had been promised and what she received, by the cold machinery that had selected her for a role rather than a marriage, and she died at 36, hounded and unhappy, another casualty of the institution's needs. Camilla was made to wait decades, vilified and hidden, her own happiness subordinated for years to the requirements of the crown, before she was finally allowed it. And Kanga was used for her warmth, drawn into the prince's life because she gave him something he was starved of, and then frozen out and abandoned when her indiscretion made her a liability. 3 women, 3 different fates, but one consistent truth running through all of them. The institution took what it needed from each of them and gave back only what served its own purposes, subordinating every one of their happinesses in different ways and to different degrees to the survival and the image of the crown. This is the thing the pageantry conceals, and the official story omits, the human cost of the machine. The monarchy presents itself as a thing of dignity and continuity and romance, the Charles and Camilla love story now told as a tale of patient devotion finally rewarded, the institution's image carefully maintained against everything that would tarnish it. And beneath that image lies a trail of damaged and discarded people. The casualties the story leaves out, the women used and broken and forgotten so that the pageant could go on. Kanga is one of those casualties, and her life, told honestly, is a window onto the cost that the institution's survival exacts from the people it draws into its orbit and then no longer needs. The crown shines, and the shine is paid for, and the people who pay for it are written out of the story that the shine is meant to tell. And yet, having said all of that, having laid out the institution's coldness and the pattern of sacrifice, honesty now demands a harder and more careful thing, which is to resist the temptation to make Kanga's story simpler and more sinister than it actually was. Because the danger in telling a story like this is to slide from the true claim that the institution abandoned her into the false claim that the institution destroyed her, to turn a tale of coldness and neglect into a tale of conspiracy and murder, and that false turn must be refused, both because it is not supported by the evidence and because Kanga deserves the truth of her life rather than its conversion into a thriller. The plain facts are these. Kanga's body was compromised from birth, marked by spina bifida, and broken in childhood by Perth's disease, vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with the royal world. The cancer that struck her in 1993 was a disease, a malignancy in her own flesh, not an act of any human hand. The dependency that took hold of her grew from the painkillers prescribed to treat that disease, a tragedy of medicine and chemistry that befalls countless people with no connection to palaces or princes. The depression that overwhelmed her was an illness, severe and real, the kind that destroys lives across every level of society. The marriage that failed her had been failing since 4 months after the wedding. By her own account, a private unhappiness between 2 people that owed nothing to any institution, and the fall that paralysed her, whatever its true nature, happened in a clinic she had entered herself, in circumstances that remain genuinely unknown. The institution did not give Kanga cancer. It did not make her drink. It did not break her marriage or fracture her skull. Much of what destroyed her was illness and misfortune, and the frailties of her own body and life, forces that no conspiracy is needed to explain and that no palace set in motion. To pretend otherwise, to claim that the palace orchestrated her destruction, or that Charles engineered her ruin, would be a lie, and it would also be a disservice to the real and complicated woman at the centre of the story. Kanga was not simply a victim of a royal plot. She was a human being undone by a convergence of afflictions, some of them medical, some of them circumstantial, some of them flowing from her own nature and her own choices. The need to be seen as special, the inability to keep silent, the courting of journalists who would turn on her, these were her own traits, and they contributed to her downfall as surely as any external force. She was not faultless, and to make her faultless would be to flatten her into a martyr she was not. The truth is that she was a vivid, flawed, suffering woman brought down by many things at once, and the honest telling of her story has to hold that complexity rather than dissolve it into the comfort of a single villain. But, and this is where the honest verdict finally lands, the institution's hands are not clean either, and its coldness is a real part of the tragedy even if its malice is not. Because while the palace did not cause Kanga's illnesses, it did abandon her in the midst of them, and the abandonment had consequences. The freezing out removed from Kanga the world that had been the center of her identity at the very moment she most needed something to hold on to. The withdrawal of the royal circle stripped away her support, her belonging, her sense of who she was, precisely when illness and depression were attacking the rest of her foundations. The press she had courted turned on her, the very journalists she had treated as friends feeding on her decline, and the secrecy and discretion that surrounded everything to do with royals ensured that even the truth of her catastrophe, the real nature of her fall, would never be clearly established, leaving her final ordeal wrapped in an obscurity that served the institution's comfort and denied her the dignity of a clear account. The palace did not destroy Kanga, but it stood by cold and deniable while she was destroyed, having first removed the supports that might have helped her survive. And there is a kind of guilt in that abandonment, even though it is not the guilt of murder. This is the precise and honest shape of the institution's responsibility. Not a conspiracy, but a coldness. Not a crime, but a desertion. Not the active destruction of a woman, but the passive abandonment of her. The withdrawal of warmth and belonging, and protection from someone who had given the institution 20 years of her life, and who was, at the end, of no further use to it. The royal world did to Kanga what it does to all those who become inconvenient. It let her go quietly without explanation, and then it looked away while the forces of illness and despair and some circumstance finished what the freezing out had begun. The machine protected its own, as it always does, extending to the silent Camilla the rehabilitation and the crown, while the talking Kanga was left outside in the cold to die. And the coldness, the deniable fingerprintless coldness of it, is the institution's real offence, smaller than murder and in some ways more chilling, because it requires no villain, only the ordinary operation of a system that values its own survival above the lives of the people it uses. And then, having abandoned her in life, the institution did to Kanga the final thing it does to its inconvenient casualties. It erased her. Consider how completely Camilla Tryon has been written out of the story that is now told about Charles and the women in his life. The official narrative, the one that has hardened into accepted history, is the story of Charles and Camilla, the great enduring love, the patient devotion that survived every obstacle and was finally rewarded with marriage and a crown. It is a story with a clear shape and a satisfying arc, the prince and his true love kept apart by circumstance and reunited at last, and it has become the authorized version of his emotional life. And in that version there is no room for Kanga, the rival of the 1970s, the woman he called the only one who understood him, the intimate of 20 years, has been almost entirely removed from the tale. She survives, if she survives at all, as a curiosity, a question asked on internet forums, the subject of a single niche documentary provocatively titled "To Suggest the Scandal of Her," a footnote that most people who follow the royals have never even encountered. The woman who was once a serious rival to the woman who became queen has been reduced to an obscurity so complete that her own existence in the prince's life is news to almost everyone. The erasure was sealed, in its way, by the vanishing of the letters. The documents that proved Kanga's place in the prince's life, the tangible evidence of his affection in his own hand, disappeared in her final days, leaving her story without its anchor, her significance without its proof. And so the official version could proceed unchallenged, the Charles and Camilla story, told without the inconvenient evidence of the other woman who had mattered. Kanga's claim to importance left to survive on nothing but the word of a woman the world had already learned to discount as indiscreet and unreliable. The proof of her story vanished, and her story vanished with it. And the version that remained was the one that served the institution and its new queen, the tidy narrative with the casualties edited out. There is a phrase that has attached itself to Kanga in the few places she is still remembered, the suggestion that she was erased from history, and the phrase is more accurate than it might first appear. She was erased, not by a single act of deletion, but by the ordinary processes of a story being shaped to suit the powerful. The woman who talked was written out. The woman who kept silent was crowned and became the center of the authorized tale. And the contrast is the final, perfect illustration of the rule that governed both their lives. Discretion was rewarded with a throne and a permanent place in history. Indiscretion was punished with abandonment and erasure, with a death barely noticed and a memory nearly extinguished. Kanga had wanted, more than anything, to be known as special, to have the world recognize her place in the prince's heart. And the world's final answer to that wish was to forget her almost entirely, to write her out of the story she had so desperately wanted to be central to leave her as a question on a forum and a footnote in a tale that belonged now to the woman who had known how to stay quiet. And yet the connection between the Tryons and the crown did not vanish entirely, and the small ways it has persisted carry their own quiet and ambiguous meaning. Kanga's son, the boy christened Charles in 1976, with the prince himself as godfather, grew up to inherit his father's title and to remain, as his father had been, close to the royal family. He is the king's godson still, and in the reign of King Charles III, the connection has shown itself in a touching and revealing way, for the king's godson's own young son, Kanga's grandson, has served as a page of honour to the king, taking his place in the ceremonial life of the monarchy, a child of the Tryon line, attending the very man his great-grandmother had loved and been destroyed in the orbit of. The thread that bound Kanga to Charles has not been entirely severed. It runs on, quietly, through her descendants, into the present reign, the godson and his page of honour son, carrying the old connection forward, even as the woman at its origin has been forgotten. What to make of that continuity is genuinely uncertain, and the uncertainty is itself a fitting note on which to consider the prince at the centre of it all. It would be possible to read the persistence of the connection as a sign that Charles never forgot Kanga, that some loyalty or affection survived in him, expressed in the quiet way the royals express such things, through the maintenance of ties to her family across the generations. It would be equally possible to read it as nothing more than the ordinary continuity of aristocratic relationships, the Tryons remaining in the royal orbit because that is simply where such families remain, with no particular meaning attached to Kanga at all. The truth is unknowable, and Charles himself has never spoken of it, never explained what Kanga meant to him in the end, or how he regarded her destruction. He released his careful statement in 1997, the one noting that they were no longer the close friends they had once been, and beyond that the prince who became king has left the matter in silence, the silence that the royal world wraps around everything it prefers not to examine. And this returns us, at the last, to the question of Charles himself, the man at the centre of every relationship in this story, and the honest verdict on him is as layered as the verdict on the institution. He was not a villain. By every account he was capable of real feeling, a sensitive and lonely man who had genuinely loved the women in his life, who had called Kanga the only one who understood him and surely meant it, who had remained devoted to Camilla through decades of obstacles. He was, in his way, as much a product of the institution as its beneficiary, raised in its coldness, shaped by its demands, denied by it the freedom to marry the women he actually loved, his own happiness subordinated for years to the requirements of the crown. There is a case to be made that Charles was himself a kind of victim of the machine, pushed into a loveless marriage for the sake of suitability, kept from Camilla for decades, his emotional life distorted by the impossible position the institution placed him in. But the case for Charles as victim only goes so far, and it does not absolve him of his part in what happened to the women around him. Because whatever the institution did to him, Charles was also a man who benefited from it, who accepted its protection, who allowed it to use and discard the people he cared about while he remained at its centre. Kanga was frozen out, and Charles did not save her. He had the standing, the influence, the closeness to her over 20 years, and when the warmth drained away and she descended into ruin, the official word was that he saw her once or twice a year. Whatever he felt, he let the institution do what it does, let the cold machinery freeze out the woman he had loved, made no grand gesture to hold on to her, allowed her to pass into abandonment and obscurity while he went on, protected and central, toward the throne that awaited him. He is not guilty of destroying her. He is guilty perhaps of the same thing the institution is guilty of standing by, of looking away, of letting a woman he had cared about be discarded, because saving her would have cost him something the institution did not wish him to pay. And that quieter guilt, The guilt of the man who lets the machine do its work and keeps his own hands clean is the guilt that Charles shares with the world that made him. So what, in the end, was Kanga Tryon, and what does her life finally mean? She was the woman who got too close to the crown and paid for it. Though the payment was extracted across years and through a convergence of forces no single villain controlled. She was a vivid, flawed, courageous, indiscreet woman who rose from a hospital bed in Melbourne to the heights of the royal world on the strength of her own irrepressible nature, and who was brought down by the collision of her own frailties with the coldness of the world she had given her life to. She was destroyed in part by illness and misfortune that no one caused, and in part by her own inability to keep the one rule that mattered, and in part by an institution that abandoned her when she ceased to be of use, and erased her when she was gone. Her tragedy was not a simple one, and its meaning is not a simple lesson, but the truth at the heart of it is clear enough. The royal world protects its own and discards everyone else, rewards silence and punishes the voice, takes what it needs from the people it draws into its orbit, and gives back only what serves its survival. Kanga learned that truth too late to be saved by it, and she paid for the lesson with everything she had. The brightest light in every room she had ever entered went out in a hospital bed at 49, paralysed and divorced and sectioned and forgotten. In the shadow of another woman's more famous death, her letters vanished, her story nearly erased, her place in the heart of a future king reduced to a question that hardly anyone remembers to ask. The girl who had escaped the irons of her childhood and run at the world with an appetite that never flagged, ended her life as still as she had begun. Her body broken, her world gone, her name slipping out of the story she had wanted so desperately to be central to. She had brushed against the crown, had been warmed by it and lifted by it and let into its most private rooms, and the crown had used her warmth and then turned cold, and the cold had helped to kill her. That is the real story of Kanga Tryon, the story behind the footnote, the truth that the tidy official version leaves out. She got too close to the crown, and the crown, which protects itself above all things, and never the people who love it, let her pay the full price, alone, in the dark, while it went on shining as though she had never existed at all. And perhaps that is the final and most damning thing that can be said, not about Kanga but about the world that destroyed her. It did not need to hate her to ruin her. It did not need to plot against her or push her or wish her dead. It needed only to do what it always does, to protect its own and abandon the rest, to reward the silent and erase the voice, to take what it wanted and look away from the cost. The machine did not murder Kanga Tryon. It simply let her go and looked elsewhere and went on. And a vivid, difficult, irreplaceable woman who had loved a prince and been loved by him died forgotten because of it. One more name in the long, quiet list of those the crown has used and discarded. The casualties beneath the pageant. The price that the shining of the crown is always, somewhere, being paid by someone the world has agreed to forget. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.